Chapter 168. Go to see Net. Li Yundong suddenly received a call from Su Chan, which was really a pleasant surprise. However, when he suddenly heard Su Chan burst into tears, he suddenly panicked. He walked to the balcony and whispered, "Girl, what's wrong? I miss you too." Su Chan was scared at first, but she finally found an opportunity to call Li Yundong's cell phone. She was afraid that no one would answer, and she was also afraid that another woman would answer the phone. While waiting anxiously, the little girl finally heard Li Yundong's familiar and gentle voice. She suddenly couldn't help crying. Go to see Net. 7 K.O.M. Su Chan sobbed and said, "Master, do you not want me anymore?" Hearing Su Chan's voice, Li Yundong's heart ached a little. The longing that had been suppressed because of the high-intensity cultivation in the past few days was suddenly aroused. He said softly, "Don't be silly. How could I not want you?" Hearing Li Yundong comforting her, Su Chan wiped her tears and said, "There are so many beautiful women around you all day long. Will you fall in love with them?" Li Yundong suddenly felt happy in his heart. He couldn't help laughing and said, "Jealous? Not bad. Didn't you always push me to other beautiful women before?" Su Chan sniffled and choked, "You're so annoying. Answer my question first." Li Yundong smiled and said, "Silly girl, there are so many beautiful women in the world, but I only like you." Su Chan was overjoyed when she heard this. Holding the phone, she couldn't help but smile. "Why?" Li Yundong said softly, "Because the girl has been with me from the beginning." Su Chan giggled when she heard this. She remembered the woman's cold snort when she answered her phone and couldn't help curling her lips. "Then why was there another woman talking on your phone just now?" Li Yundong was stunned. "Another woman? No, I just received your phone call. I just went out to buy vegetables." Su Chan pouted and said, "But there was a woman who answered my call before you." She snorted and hung up. Humph, Li Yundong couldn't help but look back at the living room. Wan Hongling had been paying attention to Li Yundong. She felt a little guilty in her heart. When she saw Li Yundong looking at her, she immediately avoided his eyes. Watch Net. 7 K.O.Hong.O.M. Li Yundong was not stupid. He immediately understood what was going on. Although he was angry in his heart, he did not show it on the phone. He still said in a soft voice, "It should be someone else who answered the phone." She seemed to have thought of something and asked tentatively, "Yundong, is Zi Yuan teaching you cultivation now?" Li Yundong paused. "How did you know?" Su Chan giggled. "There's nothing I don't know. There's nothing I don't know." Li Yundong laughed and said, "Wow, you're so shameless to blow the conch. Your master must have told you." Su Chan didn't blush. She giggled and said, "My master is so smart." As the little girl spoke, she suddenly rolled her eyes and said, "You went out to buy vegetables just now. Were you cooking for Zi Yuan and the others?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "My girl is also very smart. You got it right on the first try." Su Chan snorted and said sourly, "I want to eat it too. I haven't eaten your food for several days. I'm craving it." Li Yundong laughed and said, Okay, when you come back, I'll cook for you every day." Su Chan was overjoyed. "That's what you said. Pinky swear." The girl's sweet and innocent tone made him feel as if Su Chan was standing right in front of him. She leaned forward slightly, then stretched out her little finger and looked at him with a sweet smile. Her eyes were like two crescent moons when she smiled. Li Yundong couldn't help but become lively and gentle. He subconsciously stretched out his hand, hooked it with his little finger, and said softly, "Pinky swear for 100 years, don't change." Su Chan also said on the phone, "Pinky swear for 100 years, don't change." As they spoke, although both of them were holding their phones, they felt as if the other party was standing right in front of them. Their voices and smiles were lifelike and within reach, and an invisible thread pulled them together tightly. Go to watch net. 7 KOM. Net. Super_speed. More. New. Su Chan giggled and said, okay, I believe you. But, Yundong, Zi Yuan is a powerful figure that my master can't stop praising. You have to learn more from her. She comes from a famous and decent sect, so she is definitely more suitable to teach you than me. Li Yundong smiled and said, but I'd rather you teach me. Su Chan giggled and said, really? Why do I feel like I don't know anything? I'm just making trouble for you. As Su Chan said this, she suddenly exclaimed and said anxiously in a low voice, my master is back. I'll hang up first. As she said this, she pressed the phone, then turned around and hid it behind her back. Although Ao Wushuang hadn't seen Su Chan make the phone call, she had been through it. When she saw Su Chan's guilty look, how could she not understand what a little girl like her was doing? Ao Wushuang smiled and didn't say anything. She walked up to Su Chan and spread out her hands. Under the pressure of Ao Wushuang, Su Chan didn't dare to resist at all and obediently handed over the phone. Ao Wushuang looked at Su Chan with a face full of disappointment and scolded, I've only been out for 2 minutes, and you can't wait to contact your lover. Not bad. You've been out for a few months, and you can even use a mobile phone. Do you really like him or do you really hate him? Su Chan lowered her head, and her chin was almost touching her chest. She rubbed the ground with her toes, rubbed the corners of her clothes with both hands, and said pitifully, I like him. Ao Wushuang said angrily, if you like him, then hold back. Don't contact him. Do you want to hurt him? Su Chan responded in a low voice, oh. But after a while, she raised her head timidly and asked weakly, then, Master, when can I contact him again? Ao Wushuang snorted and said, wait until he passes the divine punishment. Oh, Su Chan said and lowered her head. After a while, she raised it again and asked weakly, then, Master, how do I know when he will pass the divine punishment? Ao Wushuang looked at Su Chan speechlessly. You are a three-tailed spiritual fox. Why are you acting like an idiot who has just entered the cultivation world? When the divine punishment comes, how can the cultivation world not know about it? Oh, Su Chan said again and lowered her head. But after a while, she raised it again. Just as she was about to speak, she saw Ao Wushuang glaring at her angrily. Su Chan was so scared that she quickly lowered her head again. She didn't dare to raise it no matter what, but her eyes were rolling in their sockets. She looked around with shifty eyes, as if she was thinking about something. After a while, Ao Wushuang handed her a train ticket and said, let's go. I just got the ticket. Su Chan took the train ticket, looked at the destination, and said strangely, Master, what are we going to Dongwu City for? Ao Wushuang sighed and said, why don't you want to make progress at all? How can our Fox Zen school have such a strange person like you? Do you want your lover to leave you far behind in the future? Are you going to leave your cultivation behind? In the end, don't become a burden to him. Su Chan suddenly raised her head and asked in surprise, Master, where are you taking me to cultivate? It's a good place for cultivation. Now that you've entered the secular world, I think you won't be able to stop if I take you back to the mountains. You might as well cultivate in Dongwu City. I also have a place to stay there, so you can cultivate in peace. Ao Wushuang nodded and said, Dongwu City is a 1,000-year-old ancient city with deep qi veins, beautiful mountains and clear waters, and a beautiful place for outstanding people. Su Chan smiled in surprise and said, then can I tell Yundong where I'm going first? Ao Wushuang was furious. B****, you're so sentimental. What kind of cultivation do you have? Su Chan lowered her head and pouted. She looked unconvinced and muttered, aren't you the same? Ao Wushuang was immediately defeated by Su Chan. She rubbed her temples, sighed helplessly, and said, "Save it. When his divine punishment is over, he will naturally know where you are." Su Chan blinked her eyes and responded. After a while, she asked again, "Master." Ao Wushuang was a little crazy. "What else?" Su Chan asked weakly, "Why do we have to take the train? Isn't it better to fly?" Ao Wushuang pointed to the sky and couldn't help but say angrily, "You fool, don't you see that there are so many dark clouds in the sky? It's summer now, when there are the most heavenly thunder. Do you want to fly up and be struck by lightning?" Su Chan shrunk her head and mumbled, "Didn't I forget?" Ao Wushuang was so angry that her phoenix eyes widened. "Are you deliberately annoying me?" Su Chan immediately took Ao Wushuang's arm with a smile and said coquettishly, "No, I wouldn't dare." Ao Wushuang loved her disciple very much. Otherwise, she wouldn't have protected her in every way. She would rather risk her life to lead the pursuers away and let Su Chan go alone with the Renyuan Jindan. She couldn't stand the little girl's coquettishness. As soon as Su Chan acted like a spoiled child, the anger in her heart dissipated. Although she still couldn't pull her face down, there was a faint smile in her eyes. "Humph, you don't dare. Is there anything you don't dare to do?" As she spoke, she shouted, "Hurry up and pack your things. Follow me quickly. Aren't you afraid of missing the train?" "Oh," Su Chan said and began to pack her things in a hurry. But after a while, she suddenly stopped, turned her head, and said with a groan, "Master, I'm hungry." Ao Wushuang threw a plastic bag over and said, "Let's eat this." Su Chan opened it and was immediately disappointed. "Ah! Xiaobing. It's still cold." Ao Wushuang said angrily, "I made this myself. It's good to have something to eat. You've never been picky before. Do you want to eat it? If not, give it back to me." How could Su Chan be willing to give it back? It was better than nothing. She immediately put on a protective look and took a bite. Suddenly, there was a cracking sound, and a tooth was almost broken by the hot xiaobing. The little girl let out a cry and covered her cheeks. She thought of the delicious food that Li Yundong had made for her in the past, and then looked at the cold and hard xiaobing in front of her. She didn't know how many years it had been there. Suddenly, she felt sad. Her eyes were full of tears, and her heart was cold. The more Su Chan thought about it, the sadder she became. She couldn't help curling her lips and saying, "It's not as delicious as Yundong's food." Ao Wushuang looked at her and couldn't help laughing out loud. Evil disciple, /om/. Chapter 169. Go to watch net. After Su Chan hung up the phone, Li Yundong returned to the room and looked back and forth at Zi Yuan and Wan Hongling with an unfriendly expression. Go to watch net. Zi Yuan and Wan Hongling were both cultivators, so they had excellent hearing. They had clearly heard what Li Yundong had said before. Therefore, one of them looked magnanimous, while the other looked sneaky. Li Yundong's heart was as clear as a mirror. Li Yundong's eyes were so sharp that Wan Hongling couldn't help but slap the table and say, "Well, stop looking. I answered the phone before. What do you think?" Li Yundong said angrily in a deep voice, "Why did you answer my call? And why did you hang up with a snort?" Wan Hongling had never been questioned by a boy like this before. She immediately stood up and said loudly, "I just don't want to see you abandon yourself and hang out with those evil monsters." Li Yundong saw that not only did she not apologize, but she also said such words. He immediately became furious and said, "It's none of your business who I'm with. Please don't meddle in other people's business in the future." Wan Hongling had been secretly praising Li Yundong in her heart, and her impression of him had greatly improved. But at this time, she suddenly felt that the man in front of her was simply the most hateful person in the world. She couldn't help but say angrily, "Who wants to meddle in your business? Bah! If it weren't for Sister Zi Yuan, I wouldn't have bothered to talk to you. As she said this, she turned her head and rushed to the balcony, jumping back. Zi Yuan looked helplessly at Li Yundong, who was still angry, and sighed slightly. Why do you have to do this? Li Yundong said angrily, it's fine if I don't settle the score with her for hurting Su Chan. How can she touch my personal belongings? What right does she have to touch my things? Didn't her parents discipline her well? Zi Yuan sighed and said, Hongling's parents died when she was a child. I brought her up. If you want to blame someone, blame me. Although Li Yundong was angry, he still respected Zi Yuan very much. He just turned his head to the side and didn't say anything. Zi Yuan thought for a moment and said, although time is still a little tight, if you keep practicing here like this, the effect won't be very good. Why don't you go to Tibet tomorrow? Li Yundong asked in surprise, why are you going to Tibet? Zi Yuan said with a serious expression, cultivation. Li Yundong became more and more confused. Why do you have to go to Tibet to cultivate? When cultivators reach the Zhuji phase, they often choose to do so on the mountain. Do you know why? Li Yundong shook his head. I don't know. Watch net. Zi Yuan said, because the mountain is the place where the spirit qi in the world gathers the most. Not only is the air good, but it is also closer to the imperial court of cloud sky, so it is easier to feel the power of the sky and the earth. The higher the mountain, the more it is like this. Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat. He could vaguely feel her intentions. He asked tentatively, do you mean that I should go to the Zhuji phase on the mountain in Tibet? Zi Yuan nodded. Times are different now. Basically, the famous mountains have been greatly contaminated by the world, but the mountains in Tibet have not. They are still pure. Therefore, you can go there to cultivate your foundation. Li Yundong thought for a while, then sighed and said, that's good, but I don't have the money to go. Zi Yuan smiled and said, why, do you still want to fly over? No, you can run there yourself. Li Yundong was dumbfounded. Run there? You must be joking, right? No, I'm not joking at all. Zi Yuan stopped smiling and said solemnly, although the Jinqi in your body is majestic and strong, it is not condensed. You can take advantage of the journey to slowly temper the Jinqi in your body, especially the first time you run. Don't stop. Run as long as you can until you can't stand it anymore. By the way, bring your fan of 7 treasures with you. Li Yundong thought that he would have to carry the fan of 7 treasures, which weighed more than 50 kilograms, all the way to Tibet. He couldn't help but shiver and stare blankly. Seeing his expression, Zi Yuan was not surprised. She just said softly, if you don't go through the bone-chilling cold, how can you smell the fragrance of plum blossoms? Don't think that cultivation is a very simple thing. It is the most difficult way of heaven in the world, so naturally, it has to go through the most tests. If you feel that you can't hold on, think about the agreement you made with Su Chan. Li Yundong's heart suddenly trembled, and his eyes gradually revealed a firm look. He nodded to Zi Yuan and said, I understand. Where am I going in Tibet? Zi Yuan smiled slightly. Where is the highest in Tibet? Li Yundong said in surprise, you don't mean Mount Everest in the Himalayas, do you? Zi Yuan smiled and said, where else is higher? Li Yundong smiled bitterly. You don't want me to climb to the top of Mount Everest to build the Zhuji phase, do you? I'm afraid I'll freeze to death before I can climb to the top of the mountain. Zi Yuan said, you don't have to reach the top of the mountain. When you climb to a certain level, the Jinqi in your body will have a strong reaction, and then you can start building the Zhuji phase. Go to the internet. 7KOM. I can't tell you the specifics. You're the only one who knows this kind of thing best. Li Yundong took a deep breath and said, I understand. When should I go? Zi Yuan thought for a moment and said, you can prepare first. Tomorrow. Li Yundong was stunned. Tomorrow? So soon? Zi Yuan looked at Li Yundong seriously. Do you think there's still a lot of time left for you? Li Yundong didn't say anything. He went back into the room and began to tidy up his clothes. Zi Yuan stood outside the door and watched for a while. Seeing that Li Yundong had sorted out a lot of things and even stuffed his notebook into his bag, she couldn't help saying, "Just prepare 2 sets of clothes. Don't bring too many things. Just the fan of 7 treasures is enough for you." Li Yundong was stunned for a moment, then began to clear out the things in the bag. He only prepared a few sets of clothes, then he thought for a moment, poured a few bottles of water, and put them in the bag. Li Yundong was busy for a while, and suddenly remembered a very important thing. He only had a few hundred yuan on him. How could it be enough to spend on the way? Zi Yuan seemed to notice what Li Yundong was thinking. She said, "Are you worried that the travel expenses along the way might not be enough?" Li Yundong smiled awkwardly and said, "Yes, I only have a little money on me." Zi Yuan said, "You're not thinking about buying food when you're hungry and finding a hotel to sleep when you're sleepy, are you?" Li Yundong couldn't help but ask, "Are we going to go there on an empty stomach all the way? Sleep when you're sleepy?" Zi Yuan didn't answer and asked, "Do you know how I cultivated back then?" Li Yundong shook his head. Zi Yuan said, "At that time, I begged alms all the way and walked more than 2,000 miles. When I was hungry, I found food on the ground. When I was thirsty, I drank water from the mountains. When I was sleepy, I found a place to sit down and take a nap. It took me 35 days to reach my destination." Li Yundong couldn't help but look at her in shock. He couldn't imagine how a fairy-like woman like her, who had an otherworldly temperament, could complete this kind of ascetic monk-like cultivation. Zi Yuan said, "Every year, the Buddhist disciples of the Lamaism have to walk 1 or 2,000 kilometers in order to make a pilgrimage. They are much more miserable than us, but there are still countless devout believers who go to the snow mountain every year. Even mortals like them can stand it. As the successor of Jindan stage, can't you stand it? If you can't stand it, how can you stand it when the divine tribulation comes? When heaven is about to give a person a great responsibility, it must first satisfy his will, tire his muscles and bones, starve his skin, empty his body, and mess up his actions. Therefore, it is necessary to be patient and do what he can't do." Zi Yuan said word by word, her tone unprecedentedly solemn. "Don't think that cultivation is the easiest thing in this world just because you've reached the sky in one step. On the contrary, if you haven't experienced real sharpening and you meet a strong opponent in the future, even if your spiritual energy surpasses that of others, it will be easy for your will to be destroyed and defeated, because you haven't experienced real sharpening." Li Yundong suddenly became solemn. He nodded and finally treated this cultivation as the most difficult thing in his life. He first sat down and thought about it carefully, then suddenly stood up and went to the room to find a pair of scissors. Then, he cut open a few pieces of his clothes and wrapped the cut strips of cloth around the fan of 7 treasures. Zi Yuan looked at his movements and nodded secretly. There was a hint of appreciation on her face. "By the way, this fan of 7 treasures must not be seen by others. Otherwise, if other cultivators see it, they might be tempted by the treasure and try to snatch it." After Li Yundong wrapped the fan of 7 treasures, he made a strap with a thick strip of cloth and carried it on his back. He walked around the living room, tried to run, and jumped a few times. Then, he took off the fan of 7 treasures and readjusted the length of the strap. When he felt that it could be carried on his back diagonally, he nodded in satisfaction. Zi Yuan watched him walk to the door, squat down, and begin to put on his shoes. She asked in confusion, "You don't want to go out now, do you?" Li Yundong didn't look back, and there was a rare firmness in his voice. "As you said, I don't have much time left. If I delay 1 more second, I will waste 1 more second. Anyway, I've eaten today, so I might as well go out now. As he spoke, Li Yundong had already put on his shoes. He stood up, stamped his feet, and then looked at Zi Yuan. Is there anything else I should pay attention to? Zi Yuan thought for a moment and said, don't be nosy on the way, especially after entering Tibet. Try not to get in touch with the locals and don't get into disputes with them. Everything is about cultivating the Zhuji phase. When you complete the Zhuji phase, I will come to find you. Li Yundong nodded. He carried his tidied clothes and the fan of 7 treasures on his back. Before he went out, he looked back at Zi Yuan and nodded. Well, thank you. Zi Yuan smiled slightly. You don't have to thank me. I'm also doing it for my own cultivation. Li Yundong was stunned, but he didn't have time to think about it. He just said goodbye to Zi Yuan and went out by himself. After leaving Hongqing New Area, Li Yundong immediately ran to the nearest newsstand and bought a map of the whole country and Tiannan City. He looked at the map for a while, confirmed the direction, and then began the long and arduous journey of cultivation. He was carrying a big iron fan that was nearly as tall as a person and wrapped tightly with cloth strips. There was also a bundle hanging on the big iron fan, which looked strange and immediately attracted the attention of the passers-by. Li Yundong felt a little strange under these gazes. He couldn't help but speed up his pace. As he ran, Li Yundong suddenly thought of what Zi Yuan had said to him, run all the way, this can temper your Jinqi. Although Li Yundong didn't understand why running could temper his Jinqi, he still did it. In the early summer of June, on the streets of Tiannan City, a young man carrying a heavy luggage was running quickly, attracting the attention of many passers-by along the way. The sun was hanging high in the sky. Li Yundong couldn't help but raise his head and look at the vast sky. This was the first time he had gone so far alone, and it was the first time he had gone to such a far place with 2 legs. He couldn't help but sigh and feel confused. Where was his path? What would this cultivation journey be like? How would he build the Zhuji phase when he reached the Himalayas? He didn't know. He didn't know any of this. The only thing he knew was that if he wanted to know the answer, he could only slowly explore and explore on the journey. This was not only the first long journey in his life, but also the first journey he had embarked on the road of cultivation. No one knew how far this young man would go in order to become stronger. /om/ Chapter 170. Go to see net. In the past, when Li Yundong was an otaku, he had never thought that eating and sleeping were also a kind of cultivation. Even running was a kind of cultivation. Ever since Li Yundong had read Inner Canon of the Yellow Emperor, although he couldn't fully understand all the content in it for a while, he relied on his strong memory to forcibly memorize the content in his mind. In the future, he would naturally understand it slowly. Go to see net. When he first started running, he didn't feel anything strange about his body. This was because his body had been transformed by the Renyuan Jindan to become extraordinarily strong. This kind of strength not only included strength, but also a strong adaptability and durability. Ordinary people could carry 100 kilograms of things, so Li Yundong could carry 500 kilograms of things. Ordinary people would gasp for breath after running 500 meters, but Li Yundong could still run 5,000 meters in one breath without a change in his expression and heart rate. But when Li Yundong carried the psychic fan of 7 treasures, which weighed more than 50 kilograms, and ran for nearly 10 kilometers, he began to feel that there was a stream of hot air constantly rising in his body. This hot air continued to expand, turning his chest and internal organs upside down. This feeling made Li Yundong very uncomfortable at first, just like what he had experienced when he went on a rampage in school. It was as if he had become a pressure cooker, and his body was full of swelling hot air. The more he ran, the more swollen it became. Li Yundong wanted to tear all his clothes and then cut open his chest to let the qi in his body leak out. Li Yundong wanted to stop and let the qi in his body slowly calm down, but he suddenly remembered what Zi Yuan had said, don't stop the first time you run. Run as far as you can until you can't stand it anymore. Li Yundong gritted his teeth and continued to run like this. After running for another 5 kilometers, Li Yundong was already out of the city. He began to feel hot all over, and each of the 36,000 pores on his body felt as if they were being pricked by needles. It was painful and itchy. Li Yundong couldn't help but feel a little shocked. He couldn't understand why such a situation was happening. But when he thought about the inner canon of the Yellow Emperor he had read, he unconsciously searched his mind for the knowledge in it to explain such a phenomenon. After thinking for a while, Li Yundong really couldn't stand the feeling of the manic heat surging in his body. His pores opened, and his body began to sweat. Go to see net. 7:0/ As soon as he started sweating, Li Yundong suddenly felt that the stuffy feeling in his body had lessened a little. Li Yundong's spirit was greatly lifted. Suddenly, his heart skipped a beat. He seemed to understand why Zi Yuan had asked him to run to cultivate his body. When a person's pores open, the primordial qi in their body will flow out, and running will make all the muscles and internal organs in the body move, forcing the pores all over the body to open and excrete the primordial qi in the body. Vitality was a person's most precious essence. According to the theory of health maintenance, vitality was the amount one had at birth. It could not be increased, only decreased. Some people were born with a lot of vitality, while others had less. It was like a gas tank. Some gas tanks were big, while others were small. As he ran, Li Yundong thought to himself, witnessing his own self-enlightenment. People who don't know how to cultivate have no way to increase their own yuanqi. Yuanqi will only slowly decrease with the passage of time. Why were children's eyes so black and bright? And why did many people's eyes become dimmer as they got older? Because children had the most vitality, their eyes were black and bright. As they grew older, they didn't pay attention to cultivating their body and mind. As a result, the yuanqi in their body would be lost, causing their eyes to lose their luster. One of the most important things to control the yuanqi and prevent it from easily leaking out was, don't sweat. When people were young, their yuanqi and energy were the most abundant, so they often didn't pay attention to this point. They would easily sweat all over, as if they had just taken a bath. Little did they know that this was a matter of great damage to their yuanqi. As Li Yundong ran, he thought about these questions in his mind. He was an extremely smart person. Just a little bit of advice from Zi Yuan had allowed him to understand a lot of problems at once. He thought, why are many sports athletes in poor health when they get old? If there was something wrong with them, then there was something wrong with them. Part of the reason was that the high-intensity training had caused some damage to their bodies, but another very important reason was that they had perspired too much when they were young, and their pores had opened too much. Their vitality had been greatly damaged, and as a result, their bodies were empty and there was no qi to rely on when they were old. Moreover, why do many weak people feel dizzy after taking a hot bath for a long time? Because the pores had been open for too long, the primordial qi in the body had escaped. Watch net. 7:0. Thinking of this, Li Yundong had unknowingly run another 5 kilometers. If it had been in the past, he would have been tired and out of breath after running 2 kilometers. But now, Li Yundong only felt that the qi in his body was surging, as if there was a high-speed motor running in his body. The qi in his body was ting, driving his body, making him run more and more powerful and comfortable. At this time, Li Yundong finally understood what running is also a kind of cultivation meant. Ordinary cultivators were afraid of perspiring and opening their pores because they were afraid that their essence qi would leak out. At this time, he was afraid that the boiling yuanqi in his body would not be able to get out. It was like a pressure cooker. If the heat kept increasing and expanding, the whole pot would explode. But if there was a leak, the pot would not explode. As Li Yundong ran and sweated, the boiling qi in his body immediately found a place to vent. His whole body became a huge cauldron with a lid. Gu Hong, the great master of the Danding sect at the end of the Eastern Han dynasty, believed that the human body was a big cauldron. If people wanted to cultivate Niden, they had to use essence and qi as the medicine guide, and use their spirit to burn and refine, and finally cultivate the human Niden. The basic skill of cultivation was the process of refining the essence and qi of the human body into Niden. Previously, Zi Yuan had thought that although the Jinqi in his body was vast, it was not condensed. But at this time, when he started running violently, the Jinqi in his body surged and rolled, and his whole body became a pressure cooker. A huge pressure was produced in his closed body, constantly washing his meridians and squeezing the Jinqi in his body. This was the same as stewing bones in a pressure cooker. If you didn't use a pressure cooker, it would take nearly an hour or two to stew the bones completely. But if you used a pressure cooker, the bones would be rotten after a while. This was the case in Li Yundong's body at this time. His body was the pressure cooker, and the Jinqi in his body was the bones. Before he knew it, Li Yundong had run nearly 30 kilometers along the main road. It was noon, and Tiannan City was a southern city. It was already very hot in June, and the sun was shining brightly. Li Yundong felt as if he had just been fished out of the water. There was not a single dry spot on his body. Every time he stepped on the pavement, he would leave a footprint on the pavement. Li Yundong was so tired that he looked like he had just been fished out of the water. Although Li Yundong was sweating all over, he did not feel tired at all. Instead, the more he ran, the more energetic he became, and the more he ran, the brighter his eyes became. While running, Li Yundong could not only feel that the Jinqi in his body was like fine steel that had been tempered thousands of times, constantly being knocked and impacted. He could even clearly feel that his internal organs were constantly wriggling, shaking with the heat in his body. Li Yundong couldn't help but think, why do so many people who love to exercise rarely get sick? Because when they exercise, the internal organs in their body will also wriggle. Although this kind of wriggling is far from comparable to the movement of muscles, it is also a kind of exercise. Every exercise will mobilize the primordial qi in the body to gather in these organs, making them constantly stronger. This principle was the same for people who learned to sing. Even if their voices were damaged in the beginning, it did not matter, because the vocal cords would become stronger and thicker the more they practiced. The internal organs of the human body also worked the same way. Li Yundong knew that at this time, the organs in his body were constantly wriggling, constantly replenishing the various organs with primordial qi. This kind of exercise was 100 times, or even 1,000 times stronger than that of ordinary people. With the medicinal power of Renyuan Jin Dan, Li Yundong's exercise for an hour was equivalent to that of ordinary people for a month. His exercise for a day was equivalent to that of ordinary people for a year. When Li Yundong ran like this for another 10,000 meters, he began to feel a dull growling sound coming from his stomach. At first, Li Yundong thought that he was hungry, but he soon realized that something was wrong. The sound in his stomach was getting louder and louder, and with every sound, he felt his body tremble. The sound was like rolling thunder in the distant sky, deep and dull, like the roar of a tiger or leopard in the depths of the mountains. Could this be the tiger-leopard thunder sound? A thought flashed through Li Yundong's mind. As a professional otaku, Li Yundong had been watching Jin Yong's wuxia novels since the first year of high school. Even now, he was still a martial arts fan. Of course, he was no stranger to the tiger-leopard thunder sound. Li Yundong had once read The Lost Martial Arts World by Li Zhongshuan, the last disciple of Master Shang Yunxiang. In this book, Li Zhongshuan asked his master Shang Yunxiang, "What is the tiger-leopard thunder sound?" Shang Yunxiang picked up a cat and placed it in Li Zhongshuan's hands, saying, "This is the tiger-leopard thunder sound." Li Zhongshuan was instantly enlightened. Cats, leopards, and tigers were all feline animals. They all had one thing in common, and that was that their stomachs would constantly produce a low, deep sound. This sound was the sound of their internal organs constantly wriggling, like rolling thunder in the distant sky. That was why it was called the tiger-leopard thunder sound. The low, deep sound in Li Yundong's stomach was the state that most martial artists were unable to reach, the tiger-leopard thunder sound. Be it cultivators or martial artists, it would take years, or even decades, of painstaking effort to master the tiger-leopard thunder sound. It took only a day for Li Yundong to master it. While Li Yundong was shocked, he also sighed at the wonders of the Renyuan Jin Dan. Without the Renyuan Jin Dan, he would never have been able to master the tiger-leopard thunder sound. His internal organs were constantly wriggling, and Li Yundong could clearly feel his bones and muscles swelling. This feeling of swelling was not painful. Instead, it was full of power. Li Yundong could feel that the qi in his body was flowing rapidly at this time. Part of the qi was leaking out of his pores, excreting the excess qi, while the other part of the qi was driving his blood to flow quickly. The more Li Yundong ran, the more comfortable he felt. The more he ran, the more energized he felt. His running speed was comparable to that of a normal person sprinting for 100 meters. This terrifying speed shocked some of the passers-by on the road, and they almost caused a car accident. Suddenly, Li Yundong felt that perhaps this cultivation was not an extremely arduous journey. On the contrary, he was enjoying it, and he would never get tired of it. /om/ Chapter 171. Go to watch net. He hadn't expected that he would run for a day and a night. Even when he was thirsty, he only slowed down a little. He took a bottle of water from his backpack and took a sip. Then he didn't even put the bottle back. He held it in his hand and continued to run. Watch net. 7 km. Li Yundong's frantic running along the way attracted the attention of many drivers. Some of them even deliberately slowed down their cars to follow Li Yundong, wanting to see how long this young man could run. But after following him for more than 10 minutes, some of them realized that this young man, who was carrying a luggage bag wrapped tightly with a cloth strip, was actually walking at a fast pace, as if he was sprinting. There was no sign of him slowing down at all. After following him for an hour, Li Yundong's speed was still so fast. These drivers were all stunned by Li Yundong and almost had an accident. How could a human run so fast for so long? Could it be that this young man is from the national track and field team? While Li Yundong was drinking water, some kind-hearted drivers took the opportunity to ask loudly, "Young man, do you need a ride?" Li Yundong waved his hand with a smile, wiped the water from his mouth, and continued running. Under the training of the tiger-leopard thunder roar, Li Yundong's internal organs became stronger and stronger. The qi in his body, which was already very strong, also became more and more vigorous. At this time, Li Yundong completely understood why Ziyuan had asked him to run all the way. It turned out that when he ran, his qi and blood would boil with it, and when he deliberately controlled the boiling qi in his body, he could constantly train the qi in his body. Long-distance running was the process of constantly tempering his internal organs and 8 extraordinary meridians. It was like building a dam in the upper reaches of the Yangtze River. At first, not a single drop of water was allowed to flow out, so the water accumulated more and more, and the water pressure became stronger and stronger. But when the water pressure exceeded the level that the dam could bear, the dam began to automatically drain water to prevent it from being broken by the flood. Watch net. This was the reason why Li Yundong began to sweat. When the human body's pores opened, it was as if the dam had opened the gate, and the accumulated water gushed out of the dam. When the water gushed out, the human body would spontaneously thicken and strengthen the dam again, and the water that could be stored would be a little more than the last time. When it couldn't stand it anymore, the dam would be opened again, and the excess water would pour out again. In this process, Li Yundong could feel that the more he exercised, the more vigorous the qi in his body became. The more he was hammered, the more condensed it became. At first it was like a rushing Yangtze River, but slowly, it became like high-pressure water gushing out from a pipe. The force was frightening. Even on the second day, he began to notice that he could control the opening and closing of his pores. He could control where he wanted to sweat and where he didn't want to sweat. After discovering this, Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat. He began to gradually close some of his pores to prevent the yuan qi in his body from leaking out. This undoubtedly increased the pressure in his body. The opening of the dam, which could originally pour out 1,000 cubic meters of water in a minute, was now reduced to only 500 cubic meters. The water pressure from this opening was naturally twice as strong as before. As the pressure increased, the impact on the meridians in his body naturally increased as well. The pressure on his internal organs also increased. For example, he originally had to withstand a pressure of 100 pascals, but now because of the increased pressure, he had to withstand a pressure of 200 pascals. This kind of sudden doubling of pressure was very similar to Sun Wukong's cultivation in the training ground in Dragon Ball, where the gravity was doubled. Although it was hard, the effect of cultivation was extremely obvious. When Li Yundong was running for the third day, his clothes had already been wet and dry. He had repeated this more than dozens of times, and his clothes were covered with sweat and salt stains. Watch net. 7 KOM. On the third day, Li Yundong could already control the pores all over his body. Only 10% of the pores were open for the qi to pour out. This meant that he could already adapt to the rolling qi under 10 times the pressure. Most importantly, during the continuous running, Li Yundong felt that the qi in his body was like a soldering iron that was constantly being beaten on a chopping board. The more it was beaten, the harder it was, and the more it was tempered, the stronger it was. His internal organs and 8 extraordinary meridians were also like a stronger and stronger dam, constantly increasing in height and thickness. It was not until the night of the third day that Li Yundong felt that he had begun to overdraft. Only then did he slowly slow down and stop by the side of the road. Li Yundong closed his eyes and adjusted his qi a little. After calming down the rolling qi and blood in his body, he carefully looked around. He found that he had run at least hundreds of kilometers away and was already on the ground of another province. Li Yundong stretched his body and smiled. He walked off the highway and found a hidden place to sit cross-legged and meditate for the whole night. That night, when Li Yundong was meditating, he could clearly feel that the qi in his body was much stronger than before. Moreover, when the true qi in his body flowed, it was not as easy as it used to be to move his whole body, like a monstrous flood. Although the true qi in his body was as strong and majestic as before, this qi was not like before, which came like thousands of galloping horses and left like a chaotic army. Instead, it had become like a condensed long snake, iron chain, and steel whip. When it left, it was like a dragon swinging its tail, leaving no trace. It was like a ragtag army that, after going through training, had begun to become a well-trained and orderly regular army. When Li Yundong opened his eyes again, it was already dawn. He stretched lazily. When he passed the highway checkpoint, he saw someone selling lunch boxes on the side of the road. He used the little money he had on him to buy one. Fortunately, the food in the mainland was slightly cheaper than in the southern cities. It only cost 5 or 6 yuan. Li Yundong looked at Li Yundong, who was sitting at the checkpoint. After Li Yundong finished his meal, he tidied up his luggage and spent 2 yuan on 2 bottles of water. After that, he continued his journey. Li Yundong went through Jiangxi, Hunan, Sichuan, and finally arrived at the border of Tibet. It had been a whole month. During the past month, Li Yundong had been living in the open. He had even sold his mobile phone for money. All his money had been used to buy some dry food and clean drinking water. During the past month, Li Yundong had completely changed. In the past, Li Yundong had smooth skin, a handsome face, and a strong body. Although he did not pay much attention to his appearance, he was always well-dressed and clean. But now, because of the long exposure to the sun, Li Yundong's skin had become bronze. His clothes had become ragged and dirty, especially the white salt on his body, which could not be washed clean after several times. His clothes had become a little white, and the sneakers on his feet had long been worn out. He could no longer wear them, so he had to throw them away and become a pair of bare feet. Li Yundong ran barefoot all the way. At first, there were countless bloody blisters on his feet, which made him grimace in pain. But after a few days, these bloody blisters had become thick calluses, and he got used to walking barefoot. His hair had grown crazily in this month. His long hair had grown over his shoulders, and it was as messy as a chicken nest. His face was unshaven, and he had grown a full beard. At first glance, he looked like a savage who had just come out of the mountains. Although he had suffered for a month, during this month, Li Yundong could only open the Baihui acupoint on the top of his head to pour out his qi. At the same time, he closed all the pores on his body. The qi in his body had been condensed like a reinforced iron pillar, powerful and not dissipating. Li Yundong didn't even know to what extent the qi in his body had become at this time, nor did he know what kind of lethality and destructive power he would have when he condensed his qi and punched. But Li Yundong knew that compared with a month ago, he was completely different. As the saying goes, the edge of a treasured sword is sharpened, and the fragrance of plum blossoms comes from the bitter cold. When Li Yundong arrived at the Belongu area of Baiyu County in western Sichuan, he finally stopped running. He looked around and found that although he was still in Sichuan, the customs here were very similar to those of the Tibetans. Many people were dressed very similar to the Tibetans. When the locals looked at a savage like him, their eyes were curious and vigilant. Li Yundong didn't care about these people's gazes and opinions. He just looked at the map and then walked in the direction of Mount Duonyen. Along the way, Li Yundong found that some devout lamas were constantly walking up the mountainside. They were wearing dark red and bright yellow clothes and gloves on their hands. They prostrated themselves on the ground all the way, looking extremely devout and solemn. Fortunately, there were also tourists among these people, so Li Yundong, an alien, was not very eye-catching. However, his dirty and shabby clothes always attracted the attention of other tourists from time to time, and their eyes were full of disgust and contempt. Li Yundong glanced at them and suddenly understood the meaning of Tang Bohu's poem, "The world laughs at me for being too crazy, and I laugh at them for not being able to see through me." These people all thought that Li Yundong was a beggar begging for food along the way. They all looked at him with disgust, afraid that he would come over and ask them for money. But who knew that Li Yundong was actually a cultivator who was hiding his strength and cultivating hard? Li Yundong sneered inwardly and continued to climb along the hillside in silence. When he was almost halfway up the hillside, a noise attracted his attention. /om/. Chapter 172. Go to watch net. Li Yundong looked in the direction of the noise and saw a group of people gathering on the road halfway up the mountain. There were pilgrims in Lama clothes, and there were also travelers in various costumes. Watch net. 7 KOM. These people were surrounding a girl who looked to be about 17 or 18 years old. This girl was dressed in white Tibetan clothing and was squatting on the ground. Her hair was full of thin braids. Her appearance was delicate and pretty, and her face was rosy, revealing a healthy youthful color. However, her expression looked very mournful. She was hugging a motionless old man and crying loudly. The old man was wearing a yellow and red lama robe. His face was full of deep wrinkles, and he looked to be in his 70s or 80s. Like the other pilgrims, he wore gloves. There was a thick layer of black callus on his forehead, and there were obvious abrasions on his chest and knees. He was obviously a devout pilgrim, but he might have fallen here because his body was too weak during the journey. The girl hugged the old man's body and cried. Some of the surrounding Buddhists sighed softly, while others spun the prayer tubes and softly chanted scriptures. These people were all talking in Tibetan. Li Yundong was confused and couldn't understand a word. Just as he was about to turn around and leave, he saw a few people squeezing in from outside the crowd. Two of them were foreigners with deep eyes and high noses, and a black-headed Chinese man. The two foreigners and the Chinese woman were all carrying huge luggage bags, wearing travel clothes specially made for mountaineering, and wearing big sunglasses. After they squeezed into the crowd, the Chinese woman squatted down and said to the Tibetan girl in Tibetan, "What happened here?" The girl raised her head and looked at them with teary eyes. "My Chambajila has gone to see the living Buddha. He left me alone on the pilgrimage." "Who are you?" The Chinese woman pointed to the two foreigners behind her and said, "They are mountaineering enthusiasts, and I'm their language interpreter and guide. I know a little about first aid. Do you mind if I show him?" The girl carefully looked at the two foreigners, her eyes full of vigilance and doubt. Seeing this, the two foreigners took off their sunglasses and greeted her in a friendly manner. Watch net. 7 K.O. Hong O.M. The girl thought for a moment and finally nodded. The female tour guide stretched out her finger to the old man and checked his breath and pulse. She frowned and turned to look at the two foreigners for help. She shook her head slightly. One of the brown-haired foreigners came forward, squatted down, and pressed his hand on the old man's neck artery. He also frowned slightly. He pressed his hand on the old man's chest and gave him heart compressions for a while. He also did artificial respiration for a while, but the old man did not move at all. The brown-haired foreigner was busy for a while. There were beads of sweat on his forehead. He looked up and shook his head helplessly. The female tour guide sighed and said to the girl, "I'm sorry, we can't do anything. He's gone." Although the girl already knew that the old man had passed away, she couldn't help but burst into tears when she heard the confirmation. Li Yundong frowned as he watched from the side of the road. He subconsciously wanted to go and have a look, but he remembered that Zi Yuan had once told him not to meddle in other people's business on the road. Thinking of this, he wanted to leave. Moreover, Li Yundong vaguely felt that someone in the crowd was coveting him. He glanced around and found a rover parked in the distance. A young man and a woman were sitting in the car, looking at him with bright eyes. When the young man and woman saw Li Yundong's gaze, they couldn't help but look away. This situation made Li Yundong frown. He subconsciously became vigilant in his heart and turned to leave. But as soon as he turned around and took 2 steps, the girl's sad cry came, making Li Yundong feel very uncomfortable. He suddenly remembered the scene of Su Chan crying in his arms. Li Yundong hesitated for a while and struggled in his heart for a long time. In the end, he sighed slightly, turned back, and walked toward the crowd. Li Yundong was dressed like a savage. Although he didn't smell, he looked very sloppy. The people around him avoided him, afraid to get close to him, as if he was a god of plague. Watch net. 7 K.O.M. Li Yundong walked up to the old man and was about to reach out his hand when he heard the two foreigners shouting. The female tour guide also looked at him with disgust and said loudly, "Death is the most important thing. What are you doing?" After saving Hardadef and Chao Kefi, Li Yundong already had some experience in such things. He turned his head to look at the female tour guide and saw that the woman had a decent appearance and looked quite beautiful. He was too lazy to answer her. He continued to stretch out his hand and help the old woman sit up. The surrounding Tibetans burst into an uproar and began to criticize him loudly. However, most of them spoke in Tibetan, and Li Yundong couldn't understand a single word. However, the girl could tell from his dress that Li Yundong looked like a Han, so she shouted in Chinese full of hostility, "What are you doing? Don't touch Chambajila. His soul has gone to see the living Buddha." You can't touch his body like this. Li Yundong glanced at the girl, smiled, and didn't say anything. He reached out his hand and pressed it on the old man's head. A strong and condensed Yuanyang genuine qi surged into the old man's body. When the surrounding Tibetans saw Li Yundong's appearance, as if he looked down on all of them, they were all angry. Some of the young people even wanted to come over and fight. The two foreigners also looked frightened. For fear of being implicated, they stood up one after another, waved their hands, and shouted, "No, no." The female tour guide also shouted, "Don't be impulsive, don't be impulsive." But what could the three of them, outsiders, do? The Tibetans were aggressive and united. They were very xenophobic. They didn't care about the three of them and rushed up to beat Li Yundong. Li Yundong was angry in his heart. He raised his head, and the jinqi in his body moved to his eyes. He rolled his eyelids, and his divine eyes swept over the people around him like lightning. Before Li Yundong had cultivated hard, his gaze could still make ordinary people tremble with fear. At this time, after a month of hard cultivation, the jinqi in his body had been like hard pig iron, but now the jinqi in his body was like fine steel that had been tempered 100 times. It was extremely hard and strong. Li Yundong's gaze swept across the crowd. Suddenly, everyone felt a pain in their eyes, as if they had seen the sun. It was so painful that they couldn't open their eyes. Their hearts beat wildly, and they immediately stopped and covered their eyes. They didn't dare to go forward, let alone shout at Li Yundong. The people around saw this abnormality for a moment, and they all looked at Li Yundong with doubt and awe. They moved further away from him. Only the girl kept her big eyes open and stared at Li Yundong without showing any weakness. When Li Yundong saw the girl, it was as if he had seen Su Chan. He didn't care about the girl. He just smiled at her gently, then lowered his head and continued to transfer Yuanyang jinqi into the old man's body. The jinqi in Li Yundong's body was so strong that he didn't need to use the three-pronged flower technique. He just pressed the old man's Baihui acupoint with his palm, and he could transfer the pure and vigorous Yuanyang in his body into the old man's exhausted meridians and internal organs. This vigorous Yuanyang qi was like the spring rain that moistened the dry land, slowly restoring the old man's vitality. Chinese medicine believed that only when the Yuanyang in a person's body was completely exhausted could the person be considered dead. Therefore, there was a saying that people had run out of luck. Such people could not be saved even by God. However, the old man's body couldn't bear the pain of the pilgrimage. For a while, he couldn't adjust the little Yuanyang in his body, so he suddenly died. Although his situation was similar to Chao Kefi's, he was old and not as young as Chao Kefi. His body had not yet been exhausted. As soon as Li Yundong's vigorous Yuanyang qi was injected into his body, the old man reacted strongly and woke up immediately. After Li Yundong injected the Yuanyang qi into the old man's body, he could clearly feel that his jinqi was like a sharp tentacle, exploring the old man's body. He began to feel that a little Yuanyang qi hidden deep in the old man's body was mobilized by him and began to gush out, responding to his jinqi and nourishing the organs in his body. Li Yundong nodded to himself, knowing that the old man had been saved by him and would wake up soon. He gradually returned the qi to his body. After that, he didn't say goodbye to the people around him. He turned around and continued his cultivation journey. These Tibetans looked at Li Yundong's back as he left and cursed. Even the female tour guide, who was his compatriot, looked at Li Yundong's back with disgust and snorted coldly. "You didn't know anything, but you messed around. You almost caused trouble." Only the girl looked at the old man in front of her with shock and ecstasy. She opened her mouth and couldn't say anything for a long time. When the people around saw her like this, they also looked at the old man curiously. They saw that the old man's pale and gray face had begun to slowly become ruddy, and his chest had begun to rise and fall slowly. The female guide and the two foreigners stared, as if they couldn't believe what was happening in front of them. Without waiting for the girl's consent, the female guide reached out her hand and pressed slightly near the artery on the old man's neck. Her eyes suddenly widened and she cried out involuntarily, "He came back to life." The two foreigners couldn't believe it. They had personally confirmed the old man's death before. How could he suddenly come back to life? The girl supported the old man with a face full of ecstasy and shouted, "Changbajila, wake up, wake up." The surrounding Tibetans saw it clearly. Under the girl's shout, the old man's eyelashes began to tremble, as if he would open his eyes at any time. They all looked happy and shouted, "Changbajila, wake up." The crowd's shouts were like a shot in the arm. After a while, the old man suddenly exhaled a mouthful of turbid qi, opened his eyes, and woke up. With tears in her eyes, the girl shouted happily and threw herself into the old man's arms. "Changbajila, I thought you were gone. Meiduo was scared to death by you." The old man looked around in confusion and suddenly said, "How could I be here? I clearly saw the living Buddha enlightening me just now and sending me to the Western paradise. How could I be here in the blink of an eye?" The surrounding Tibetans were all shocked and asked, "Changbajila, did you see the living Buddha?" The old man nodded firmly and solemnly. "Yes, I saw the living Buddha, /om/." Chapter 173. Go to the net. Did Changbajila really see the living Buddha? It's possible. I once heard from Japugla that when people are about to die, they can see the gods and Buddhas. But why did Changbajila suddenly come back to life? That's possible. Maybe the living Buddha cured him. Well, it's possible. But just now, only that Han teenager touched Changbajila strangely. After a while, he recovered. Could it be that he's the living Buddha? Impossible, impossible. He's a Han. How could he be the living Buddha? The Tibetans surrounded Changbajila and whispered to each other. When Changbajila heard their words, he shouted unhappily, "That's not right. Buddha said that all living things are equal. Where did the Han and Tibetans come from?" Changbajila was very prestigious among these Tibetans. As soon as he spoke, they all shut up, but there was still a look of disapproval on their faces. Achanjon Changbajila sat for a while and gradually regained his strength. He stretched out his hand and gestured for Meiduo to help him stand up. Meiduo said nervously, "Changbajila, you haven't recovered yet. You'd better sit down and rest for a while." Changbajila laughed. The deep wrinkles on his face were like blooming chrysanthemums. "I'm very good. I haven't felt as comfortable as I do today for more than 20 years. As he spoke, he was about to stand up. Meiduo, who was beside him, was very nervous, so she helped him stand up. As soon as he stood up, Changbajila asked Meiduo, "What on earth happened?" "I only remember that I seemed to have suddenly fainted during a pilgrimage. Then I saw the living Buddha standing behind me and giving me enlightenment." Meiduo's eyes widened. She pointed to the two foreigners and the Chinese female guide and said, "Changbajila, they felt your pulse and tested your breath. They said that you had already gone to the Western paradise." Changbajila politely put his palms together and bowed to the two foreigners and the Chinese female guide. "Tashi Delek, thank you for your help." After the two foreigners listened to the translation of the Chinese female guide, they quickly put their palms together and bowed in return. Changbajila straightened his back and asked, "Did anything else happen after that?" Meiduo hesitated for a moment and said, "A dirty Han man squeezed in and touched your head with his hand. Then he left." Changbajila's eyes lit up. "And then?" he asked. Meiduo said with a puzzled expression, "And then you woke up." Changbajila became excited and asked loudly, "Where is this person now?" Meiduo pointed in the direction of the mountainside. "He went there." Changbajila stomped his feet and said, "Meiduo, what did I teach you? Why didn't you leave him behind? That's my savior." He is the living Buddha that I saw. Before Meiduo could say anything, the surrounding Tibetans widened their eyes and said one after another, Changbajila, are you confused? How could that Han man be the living Buddha? Changbajila said loudly, I was about to go to Elysium when he put his hand on my head and I came back to life. Even Master Jalila Tenzin can't do such a thing. If he's not the living Buddha, then what is he? Changbajila's words made everyone look at each other in dismay. Their hearts began to waver. One of them said in a low voice, yeah, this guy just touched Changbajila's head, and Changbajila came back to life. This kind of method is too unimaginable. If he's not the living Buddha, then what is he? How can the living Buddha be a Han man? Oh, no matter what, I think Changbajila's life was saved by this Han man. Yes, I think this man is the living Buddha among the Han people. It was difficult to persuade these people. An old Tibetan looked at Changbajila and said, Changbajila, you are the leader of our pilgrimage. You should tell us what to do. Changbajila's face showed an embarrassed expression. He thought to himself, it stands to reason that we should catch up with him immediately and express our gratitude to our benefactor. However, pilgrims must bow every 3 steps on the pilgrimage journey. If we don't do this, it will be a great disrespect to Buddha, and we won't be able to escape to Elysium when we die. But if we bow every 3 steps, how can we catch up with this benefactor? Changbajila looked embarrassed, but Meiduo said considerately, Changbajila, I think he is also going to Kathoda Temple. He will definitely rest there for a while. Maybe he will still be there when we get there. Changbajila sighed and said, that's the only way. Let's go. 7 K.O.M. As he spoke, he turned his face again and kept lecturing Meiduo, why didn't you stop him back then? Did you have a preconceived notion because he was a Han person and have other ideas in your heart? Meiduo glanced at Changbajila timidly and shook her head weakly. No, it's just that he's too dirty. Changbajila couldn't help but say angrily, I'm still dirty. I've been worshipping all the way here. Which part of me isn't dirty? Which part of you isn't dirty? D****, Buddha said that all living beings are equal, that there is no distinction between high and low, and that there is no distinction between beauty, ugliness, and cleanliness. As my disciple, how dare you say such a thing? Don't you know that Buddha used to beg along the street and was unkempt? Meiduo, a young and beautiful girl, was reprimanded by Changbajila in front of everyone. Her eyes immediately turned red, and tears welled up in her eyes. She didn't dare to refute. She just took Changbajila's hand and said softly, Changbajila, don't be angry. If we meet him later, I'll apologize to him. You've just recovered, so don't be angry. We can't do without you. Changbajila said angrily, what if we don't meet him? I'm telling you, if we don't meet him, you will have committed an evil deed, and there will be retribution in the future. Meiduo couldn't hold it in any longer. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she had a strong personality. She turned around and secretly wiped her tears, not wanting anyone to see them. The Tibetans on the side tried to persuade him. Changbajila, don't talk about Meiduo anymore. You almost went to paradise before. You don't know how sad she was. Maybe we'll meet this Han person up ahead. Changbajila snorted and said, what if we don't meet him? The crowd looked at each other and kept silent. Changbajila stopped talking. He faced the direction of Mount Duonyen, put his palms together, raised them above his head, and knelt on the ground. Then, he kowtowed to the ground, touched his mouth, and prostrated himself on the ground. His heart touched the ground, and his whole body touched the ground. He completed the worship. When the Tibetans saw that he had started the pilgrimage, they followed him one after another. They knelt down every 3 steps as they walked toward the Kathoda temple halfway up the mountain. 2 foreigners who were climbing the mountain witnessed this scene. After listening to the translation of the female guide from China, they couldn't help but praise, what a magical country. What a magical pilgrim, what a magical living Buddha. The female guide, Lu Xia, said with a dubious look, that scruffy man is a living Buddha? I don't believe it. One of the foreigners said, it doesn't matter whether he's a living Buddha or not. What's important is that he pressed his hand on the dead old man's head and the old man came back to life. It's really amazing. Lu Xia, are all Chinese people so magical? Lu Xia curled her lips and muttered in Chinese, who knows if he's just a blind cat running into a dead mouse. When the foreigner saw that she was speaking Chinese and he couldn't understand it, he shrugged helplessly and said to his companion, "Hey, Jack, is your camera used as an ornament? Why didn't you take a picture of it just now?" Jack said, "Lubby, I didn't think of it. Don't worry, I'll take it out now. I won't turn it off again." Lubby smiled and said, "Then let's go all the way. I have a feeling that these people are going to cause trouble." Li Yunyang had no idea that a group of people was chasing him, but they were all in different ways. He had been crawling along the mountain path of Mount Dunyan. He had already gotten used to the weight of the fan of 7 treasures, which weighed more than 50 kilograms on his back. It was as light as a feather. Although he didn't run, even walking gave people the feeling that there was wind under his feet. The scenery on the side of the road kept passing behind him. When he was halfway up the mountain, Li Yunyang looked up and saw a magnificent temple standing in front of him. Under the golden sun, red palaces were densely packed like a forest. In this forest, the Naomi Sushiong Spirit Pagoda, known as the Decoration of the Snow Mountain, was clustered in the middle of the palaces. Countless small white pagodas around it extended to the hillside, as if to guide the pilgrims on the way up. Before entering the temple, Li Yunyang felt a strong sense of majesty and pressure. This was a powerful force formed by the firm faith and will of countless pilgrims over thousands of years. It was like countless gods, tightly surrounding the temple and guarding the snow mountain. What a powerful force! Li Yunyang was secretly shocked. Stimulated by this force, the Jinqi in his body suddenly surged and gathered together. It was like 2 fierce beasts in the mountain forest had suddenly encountered each other, and each of them had raised their manes. As soon as the Jinqi in Li Yunyang's body gathered, he immediately felt that the power lingering over the temple suddenly formed a Vajra Arhat with a Vajra pestle in its hand and a red sun Vajra will behind it. With a ferocious expression, it pounced on him fiercely. Li Yunyang was shocked and was about to resist when he suddenly heard an old voice in his mind. Don't be hostile. If you are strong, it will be stronger. If you are weak, it will be weaker. This sudden voice stunned Li Yundong, and he subconsciously withdrew his aura. The breath in Li Yunyang's body came and went quickly. The Vajra Arhat that pounced on him also twisted in an instant and disappeared by the time it was in front of him. Li Yunyang was shocked by this sudden attack. When he came back to his senses, he turned his head and looked around, trying to see who had warned him. However, when he looked left and right, he saw an endless stream of tourists and pilgrims. He didn't see the Vajra Arhat he had seen before, nor did he see anyone suspicious. Li Yunyang was puzzled. After thinking about it for a while, he felt that this person shouldn't be malicious, so he put this matter aside and walked into the temple by himself. When Li Yunyang was no longer vigilant and wary, he could no longer feel the strong hostility hidden in the temple. After walking into the temple, Li Yunyang looked around and found that not only were there vendors selling incense, but there were also merchants selling food and drinks. In some places, there was even a tap. He nodded to himself and thought to himself, I've been on the road for so long. I'll rest here for a night before continuing my journey. After making up his mind, Li Yunyang found a platform and sat down. Changbajila, Meiduo, and the others, who were following behind him, bowed every 3 steps along the way. Their speed was astonishingly slow. It was not until it was almost dark that they slowly walked to the Kathuo temple. Although it was night, the temple was still full of incense, and white smoke curled up. Changbajila and the head lama of the temple had been friends for a long time. After the two of them warmly exchanged greetings, Changbajila led his people to the temple to rest. After a day of worship, the group was already exhausted. Some of them even found a place to lie down and sleep. Only Changbajila sat alone on the steps outside the temple, looking at the golden plaque of the Kathuo temple uneasily. Because of what had happened during the day, Meiduo sat on the steps with Changbajila obediently. She hugged her knees with both hands and looked at the white moon in the sky with a pair of dark eyes. Meiduo, are you still blaming me for teaching you a lesson in front of so many people today? Changbajila suddenly said. Meiduo shook her head, and the little braids on her head swayed. The ornaments hanging on the braids also swayed. No, Changbajila, you're right. I shouldn't have looked at people like that. My cultivation is not enough. Changbajila looked at Meiduo lovingly. Just as he was about to speak, a figure suddenly flashed from a corner not far away. Meiduo also saw this scene and suddenly shivered. She stood up and shook Changbajila's arm excitedly. Changbajila, it's him, it's him. Changbajila was stunned. What do you mean? Meiduo said excitedly, it's the Han brother who saved you, /om/. Chapter 174. Go to watch net. When Changbajila heard this, he immediately stood up and asked, where is he? Meiduo pulled Changbajila and chased after him. I saw him pass by just now. Go to watch net. 7 KOM. The two of them chased after him in a low voice. After only a few turns, they heard the sound of water. They poked their heads out and looked under the moonlight. Meiduo's face immediately turned red. She saw Li Yundong taking off his clothes and scrubbing his body under the tap. Although it was night, the moonlight was bright. Meiduo could clearly see Li Yundong's naked body, and she could also clearly see his muscles, which were like steel bars. After a month of hard work, almost all the fat on Li Yundong's body had been burned off, leaving only developed and strong muscles. The blood vessels under his skin had become extremely thick, and when he moved slightly, the muscles on his body would roll. Under the curtain of night, Li Yundong's back was facing Meiduo. His back was broad, and water droplets rolled down his back, reflecting the cold moonlight. This made his skin look like it was made of steel. It was hard and powerful, giving people a strong sense of security and strength. Although Changbajila was an experienced and knowledgeable old man, he suddenly saw Li Yundong standing there like an iron tower. Half of his body was hidden in the darkness, and the other half was bathed in the moonlight, mysterious and majestic. He couldn't help but wonder in his heart, he looks like a young man. How can he be so powerful? Is he not the living Buddha, but the Mahagala? The Mahagala was the guardian Vajra of Tibetan Buddhism. It had 3 heads and 6 arms, and was mighty and invincible. For a moment, the two of them were stunned. They held their breath and didn't make a sound. They just watched Li Yundong scrub his body under the tap and then put on his clothes. When Li Yundong put on his clothes, he suddenly became a very sloppy beggar. This strong contrast made Changbajila and Meiduo unable to react for a moment. This was the first time Li Yundong had taken a bath in nearly 10 days. After taking a bath, he felt refreshed and comfortable. He stood where he was, secretly mobilizing the qi in his body and feeling the condensed and vigorous true qi in his body rushing through his meridians. After a while, Li Yundong sat down cross-legged and began to meditate and practice qi. Watch net. Meiduo, who was standing to one side, was stunned. She pulled Changbajila's hand and was about to speak when Changbajila pulled her aside. After a long distance, he whispered, I told you that he was a living Buddha. Do you believe me now? The Taoist meditation posture was very similar to the Buddhist meditation posture, especially when looked at from the back. Meiduo was also surprised and whispered, I didn't expect him to be a believer, but why doesn't he go on a pilgrimage? Changbajila smiled and said, we believe in Tibetan Buddhism. Perhaps he believes in Central Plains Buddhism. This is different. Meduo asked, is he a follower of Buddhism in the Central Plains? Changbajila thought about it and said, it's possible. Meduo asked, then what is he doing here? Look at him, he seems to have walked here. The calluses on his feet are very thick. Changbajila smiled and said, Meduo, you are very observant. Thinking of Li Yundong's strong body, which many Tibetan boys didn't have, Meduo couldn't help but blush a little. She averted her eyes and changed the topic. Changbajila, what do you think he is doing here? Changbajila said, many Buddhists in the Central Plains, like us, also advocate asceticism, so there is a saying about ascetic monks. I guess this person is an ascetic monk. But speaking of this, Meduo said, but he didn't shave his hair. Changbajila couldn't help frowning and said, maybe he cultivates with his hair. But I've never heard of an ascetic monk cultivating with his hair. As they were talking, the two of them suddenly heard a low sound of something breaking through the air. The girl and the old man looked at each other and slowed down to see what was going on. Seeing this, the two of them were immediately stunned. They saw a thin line of white mist emerging from the top of Li Yundong's head. Although it was night, it could still be seen with the naked eye. His chest rose and fell, and when he took a deep breath, Meduo and Changbajila felt as if the air around them had been sucked away by this young man. Meduo had sharp eyes. She nudged Changbajila with her elbow and then pointed to the ground. Changbajila looked down and was so shocked that his eyeballs almost fell out of their sockets. Go to the internet. 7 K.O.M. When Li Yundong took a deep breath, the sand and dust on the ground rolled toward him, as if he was a huge black hole. But when Li Yundong exhaled, a straight and thin white line sprayed out of his mouth. It flew more than 10 meters away, hit the red and black walls of the temple, and then scattered in all directions. The two of them were shocked by Li Yundong's abnormality. Suddenly, the qi in Li Yundong's body began to surge violently, as if there was a thunderstorm in the sky. Countless thunderbolts fell and began to fiercely attack Li Yundong's lower abdomen and lower dantian. Li Yundong knew that this was a situation where he had to enter the Zhuji phase in advance, but his current environment was not right, so he didn't dare to enter the Zhuji phase directly. He suddenly opened his eyes and instantly mobilized the surging qi in his body into his arms. Then, he jumped up, exhaled, and punched a hard rock 3 meters away. With a muffled bang, Meduo and Changbajila felt the ground under their feet tremble slightly, as if an invisible giant had just stamped on the ground. The two of them didn't dare to breathe too loudly. They just watched as Li Yundong gradually withdrew his qi and then carried the tightly tied fan of 7 treasures on his back again. Then, they left the temple and continued to climb to the top of the mountain. Meduo and Changbajila waited until Li Yundong was far away before they dared to come out. At the same time, they moved closer to the rock that Li Yundong had punched 3 meters away, which was as tall as a man. This rock was originally a treasure of the Kathuo temple, which was engraved with golden Sanskrit characters. Li Yundong had exhaled in the dark, so he didn't have time to identify it. He punched out and made a fist mark in the middle of the treasure of the temple. Meduo and Changbajila took a closer look and saw that there was a clear fist mark on the stone. With the bright moonlight, they could even see the clear and recognizable skin lines in the fist mark. Around the fist mark, the stone wall was extremely smooth, as if someone had deliberately skimmed it with a file. Meduo and Changbajila looked at each other. Both of them were so shocked that they couldn't control themselves. Meduo said, God of heaven! This Han brother is too powerful. Changbajila also murmured excitedly, Mahagala, this must be the reincarnation of Mahagala. While one of them was shocked and the other was excited, a cold cough suddenly came from behind them. Meiduo was startled and quickly turned around, only to see a boy standing in front of her. Although his hair had been washed, it was still messy and draped over his shoulders. The beard on his face almost covered his appearance. It was Li Yundong, who had returned. Li Yundong looked at Meiduo and Changbajila warily and asked in a deep voice, "Why are you following me?" At this time, Changbajila turned around and knelt down excitedly. He threw himself on the ground, the backs of his hands touching the ground, and his palms facing the sky. He said piously, "Mahagala, thank you for saving my life." Li Yundong's vigilance dropped slightly. He bowed slightly and made a gesture of bending down to support him. "You're welcome. It was just a small effort." Changbajila got up from the ground, turned his head, and glared at Meiduo, who was looking at Li Yundong curiously. He said in a low voice, "Why are you in a daze?" In Meiduo's eyes, the boy was not very tall, but his shoulders gave people a strong and burly feeling. Although his hair was messy and his face was covered with a beard, making him look like he was in his 40s or 50s, his eyes were as bright as the stars in the sky, and his voice didn't sound much older than hers. "Just how old is this Han brother?" "He doesn't seem to be much older than me, but why is he so powerful? Is it really as Changbajila said? Is he really the reincarnation of Mahagala?" Meiduo thought to herself. When she heard Changbajila's low scolding, she immediately came to her senses. Her ears were slightly red, and she said to Li Yundong in a slightly broken Chinese, "I'm really sorry for what happened today. You saved Changbajila's life, but I offended you. If you want to scold me or beat me, I will have no complaints." Meiduo was originally a beautiful woman, and she had the reputation of being the most beautiful flower in the tribe. Even her name, Meiduo, meant beautiful flower in Tibetan. Looking at a beauty under the moonlight made her even more charming and charming. Even an iron man would be a little soft-hearted when Meiduo apologized carefully, let alone Li Yundong, who was born to have tender feelings for the fairer sex. Li Yundong saw that although the Tibetan girl was dressed in a foreign style, her pure and innocent eyes were very similar to Su Chan's. He loved her, and he also had a good impression of Meiduo. Otherwise, he wouldn't have helped her on the road at all. Li Yundong nodded to Meiduo with a gentle smile on his face. "You don't have to be so polite." When Meiduo saw Li Yundong smile slightly, the way he looked at her also became particularly gentle. Although she was young, she had long understood the relationship between men and women. In addition, Tibetan girls were bold, enthusiastic, open, and lively. She subconsciously took this kind of look as Li Yundong's way of expressing his love for her. Her heart thumped wildly, and her ears turned red. As an old man in his 70s and 80s, Changbajila's heart was as clear as a mirror. He chuckled with a kind smile on his face and said in Chinese, "May I know the name of my benefactor?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "I don't deserve to be called a benefactor. Grandpa, you can just call me Li Yundong." Changbajila smiled and stroked the 3-inch-long white beard on his chest, saying, "It turns out to be brotherly. I wonder what you are doing here. Are you traveling or cultivating?" Li Yundong was stunned. He had thought that Changbajila had already recognized his identity as a cultivator when he had seen him practicing qi before. He thought for a moment and simply admitted, "I'm here to cultivate." Changbajila's smile became more and more brilliant. "That's great. We are also going on a pilgrimage to the Snow Mountain. If you don't mind, let's go together. What do you think?" Thinking of the way these people kowtowed every 3 steps, Li Yundong couldn't help but smile bitterly and refuse in his heart. He said, "I may be in a hurry, and you?" Changbajila seemed to have seen through Li Yundong's thoughts. He waved his hand and said with a smile, "We don't kowtow every 3 steps along the way. Only when we reach the foot of the holy mountain do we start to worship and move forward. Otherwise, I'm afraid that we would have kowtowed to death before we even reached the halfway point." Seeing that the old man was speaking heartily, Li Yundong couldn't help but laugh. Seeing that he was a little moved, Changbajila said to Meiduo, "Meiduo, don't you think so?" Meiduo had been a little shy under Li Yundong's gaze before and hadn't dared to look him in the eye. At this time, hearing Changbajila's words, she suddenly raised her head with some courage and enthusiasm. She looked at Li Yundong with a pair of extremely beautiful big eyes and giggled. She really had bright eyes and white teeth. "Changbajila, you're right. Han brother, if you don't mind, come with us. We can take care of each other on the way. Moreover, this plateau is very big, and there are many wolves on it. Of course, although you are not afraid of wolves, what if you get lost?" The more Li Yundong looked at Meiduo, the more he felt that she was very similar to Su Chan. He couldn't help but feel moved in his heart. He nodded and said, "Okay/OM/." Chapter 175. Go to watch net. The Kathuo monastery was very quiet late at night. The voices of Li Yunyang, Changbajila, and Meiduo attracted the attention of the lamas guarding the monastery. 2 patrolling lamas carrying lanterns spotted them and shouted, "Who's there?" The 2 lamas spoke in Tibetan. Changbajila also replied in Tibetan, "It's me, Xiangba, a friend of Abbot Danba. Watch net. 7 KOM. The 2 lamas walked closer with lanterns in their hands and immediately laughed. "Changbajila, it's you. What are you doing here so late at night?" "Hey, Meiduo, you're here too." Meiduo greeted the 2 young lamas with a smile. The 2 lamas looked at Li Yundong in confusion and asked, "Who is this? What is he doing here so late?" Changbajila smiled and said, "This is my savior." One of the slightly taller young lamas laughed. "Oh, I know. I've heard about this. Changbajila, is he the living Buddha of the Han family who saved you from Elysium?" "It doesn't look like it." Changbajila chuckled and said, "Buddha said that all living beings are equal. People can't be judged by their nobility or their appearance. Mima, don't look at him like this. He's very powerful." The young lama called Mima laughed and said, "Of course, I don't have the ability to bring the dead back to life." Li Yundong saw that they had been talking in Tibetan, and he couldn't understand a word, so he couldn't help asking Meiduo, "What are you talking about?" Meiduo smiled and said, "We are talking about you. Mima and Pu Qiong don't believe that you saved Changbagra." Li Yundong smiled and said, "It doesn't matter. As long as they don't blame me for breaking into the temple in the middle of the night." Who would have thought that Mima could understand Mandarin? "Did you barge into the temple on your own?" he asked in Mandarin. Li Yundong thought to himself, F***ck. Why would I send myself to the muzzle of a gun for no reason? Could these 2 lamas understand Mandarin? He groaned inwardly, but he forced himself to nod and said, "Actually, I've been staying in the temple and haven't gone out, so it can't be considered trespassing." Watch net. Rainbow ** literature _learning% super #fast. Update. Another lama, Pu Qiong, who had been silent all this while, also said in stiff Mandarin, "You can't spend the night in Kathuo Monastery without permission." Li Yundong knew that it was his fault, so he didn't embarrass the 2 lamas. He nodded and said, "Well, I'll leave in a while." Changbajila was shocked and hurriedly stopped Li Yundong, who was about to leave. He said sincerely, "Han brother, you are my savior. We Tibetans have no reason to drive our benefactor away. This is ungrateful. Wait here for a moment. The abbot, Danba, is a good friend of mine. I'll go talk to him. You can definitely stay here for the night." Li Yundong smiled and said, "Changbajila, it doesn't matter. I'm going to hurry through the night." Changbajila opened his hands to stop Li Yundong from going over. He said, "Han boy, you insist on leaving. Aren't you making me feel bad? In the future, if others know that I can't even repay my savior, what will they think of me? Meiduo also tried to persuade him. Yes, Han brother, although you didn't get lost after a long journey, this plateau is not like the inland. There are roads and signs everywhere. It's easy to get lost on the plateau here. You'd better wait until dawn and go with us. Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat. He secretly felt that Meiduo's words made sense, so he couldn't help but ponder. Seeing that he was tempted, Changbajila hurriedly said, I'll go find the abbot. Han brother, wait here. You must wait for my news. As he spoke, he winked at Meiduo, indicating that she must stop Li Yundong and not let him go. Meiduo nodded gently to show that she understood. Only then did Changbajila feel relieved. He waved to Mima and Pu Qiong and said, You two, take me to see Abbot Danba. Hurry up. The two young lamas glanced at Li Yundong and hesitated, but they couldn't resist Changbajila's urging, so they turned around and left with the old man. Go to watch net. 7 K.O.M. Meiduo watched them leave and said with a smile, Brother Han, don't worry. Changbajila and Abbot Danba have a very good relationship. When they were young, they became sworn brothers. Li Yundong smiled and said, I'm not worried. If it comes down to it, I can sleep outside for a night. Anyway, that's how I've been doing for the past month. Meiduo involuntarily looked at Li Yundong's bare feet and said, Brother Han, did you walk all the way here on your feet? Where did you come from? Li Yundong looked at her and smiled. Have you heard of Tiannan City? Meiduo exclaimed, I know. This is a very, very far city. It's more than 2,000 kilometers away. Li Yundong was a little surprised. You know Tiannan City? Meiduo smiled proudly and said, I'm very good at geography. I've always been in the top 3 in all my subjects in school. Don't look down on me. Li Yundong chuckled and said, I wouldn't dare. You're much better than me. Meiduo giggled. She opened her mouth to speak, but suddenly found that she couldn't find a topic to talk about. She rolled her eyes and asked again, Well, Brother Han, can you tell me how old you are? You must be working already, right? Li Yundong smiled and said, I'm still in college. I'm only 20 years old. Meiduo said in surprise, Really? You seem to be in your 30s. I didn't expect you to be only 2 years older than me. Are you a college student? I'm also going to take the college entrance exam next year. Li Yundong smiled and followed her topic of conversation. Which university do you want to go to? Meiduo had long had her favorite university in mind, but she suddenly rolled her eyes and said slyly, I don't know yet. By the way, Brother Han, which university are you going to? Li Yundong smiled and said, Tiannan University, just a third-rate university. It's not worth mentioning. Meiduo didn't know that Li Yundong was telling the truth. She knew that Han people had always been modest and introverted, so she thought that Li Yundong was being modest. She smiled and said, How about I go to your university? As she spoke, her heart suddenly began to beat wildly. Her ears turned red, and although there was shyness in the corners of her eyes, her gaze was burning and extremely bold. Li Yundong didn't notice Meiduo's gaze, nor did he notice that Meiduo's words were actually a kind of hidden test. He laughed and said, Didn't I say that this school is not good? You are so excellent. If you go there, wouldn't it be a waste of talent? Meiduo was stunned. She didn't know what Li Yundong meant by this. Was he rejecting her, or did he mean something else? She thought for a long time and felt that his words were neither a promise nor a refusal. She was unwilling to give up. She opened her mouth and wanted to test him again, but she was really a little shy in her heart. She couldn't open her mouth no matter how hard she tried. A 17-year-old Tibetan girl was facing a 20-year-old Han man in the middle of the night. Her heart was in a mess. After struggling for a long time, Meiduo couldn't help but complain in her heart, no wonder people say that Han people have a lot of tricks in their hearts. Today, I see that it's really true. If it's good, it's good. If it's bad, it's bad. How annoying. Li Yundong didn't know that the little girl had already complained in his heart. He saw that Meiduo had lowered her head and was silent for a while, so he didn't take the initiative to talk to her. He just sighed in his heart, this girl is really like Su Chan. I wonder where she is now and what she is doing. Is she thinking about me? When Meiduo saw that Li Yundong didn't take the initiative to talk to her, she felt even more resentful in her heart. There are so many young men who come to talk to me on weekdays. Why is this Han brother so arrogant that he doesn't even want to take the initiative to talk to me? Meiduo felt a little embarrassed and wanted to leave, but her feet seemed to be rooted to the ground and she didn't move at all. While the two of them were talking to each other, Changbajila found the backyard of the temple, where Abbot Danba lived. Before he entered the room, he shouted, "Danba, are you asleep? If you are, get up quickly." As he said this, he turned to Mima and Pu Qiong and said, "All right, it's none of your business. You can go first." Mima and Pu Qiong were supposed to lead the way for Changbajila, but as the three of them walked, Changbajila's pace became faster and faster. The old horse knew the way, so it didn't take long for him to walk ahead of them. Mima and Pu Qiong looked at each other, smiled bitterly, shook their heads, and left. Not long after, the wooden door creaked open, and an old man wearing a red frock and a yellow cassock walked out. The old man's eyebrows were very long, and his face was full of wrinkles. As soon as he saw Changbajila, he couldn't help sighing and saying, "Xiangba, it's so late. What are you making a fuss about here? Aren't you afraid of disturbing Buddha?" Changbajila was shocked. He first bowed respectfully to the position of Buddha in the temple, then anxiously pulled Danba's arm and said, "I have something urgent to talk to you about." Danba smiled bitterly and said, "Why haven't you changed your impatience after decades? What is it?" As soon as Changbajila told him what had happened, Danba laughed and said, "It turns out that you have found your savior. Where is he? Take me to see him quickly. I also want to see what the master who can pull you back from the Elysium looks like." As he spoke, he was about to leave, even more anxious than Changbajila. However, Changbajila grabbed Danba's arm and refused to let him go. He said, "No, you have to promise me first that he will stay here for the night." Danba smiled and said, "Is this a thing? I promise, I promise." As he spoke, he was about to leave again, but Changbajila pulled him back again and said, "Don't worry, I still have something to tell you." Danba smiled bitterly and said, "What else?" Changbajila said seriously, "This Han man saved my life. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't have been able to complete this pilgrimage. But I don't have anything to thank him with, so I want to borrow something from you." Danba immediately became vigilant. "What do you want to borrow?" Changbajila said, "The Mahamudra Secret Sutra, /om/." Chapter 176. Go to watch net. As soon as Danba heard that Changbajila wanted to borrow the Mahamudra Secret Method Sutra, he immediately shook his head like a rattle. No, no, how is this borrowing? It's clear that you won't return it. Besides, how can such an important thing be passed on to an outsider? Changbajila said unhappily, "Danba, you promised to give me a copy last time. Why are you going back on your word now? Just take it as giving me what you promised to give me in advance. You don't have to worry about who I give it to." Danba still shook his head. "No, this Mahamudra Secret Method Sutra is the most precious treasure of the Kathuo Monastery. It can't be passed down to the Han people. Go to watch net." Changbajila sneered. "Danba, are you bullying me as an outsider? Do you think I don't know that you have printed a lot of Mahamudra secret method sutra and are selling them as souvenirs? Danba's face was slightly red, but he couldn't see it clearly in the dark. He argued, that's an incomplete copy. Even if it gets out, it's not a big deal. No one can understand anything from this incomplete copy. Changbajila said, yes, you yourself said that it's an incomplete copy, and outsiders can't understand it. But even if you give me an original copy, without the teachings of a master, how can outsiders really learn the kung fu of Mahamudra? This Han man saved my life by chance. If I can't even take out a decent gift, what will others say about me if it gets out in the future? Danba hesitated. He thought for a moment, then sighed and said, wait here for a moment. Changbajila was overjoyed. Okay, I'll wait for you here. After a while, Danba came out of the house with a beautifully wrapped book as thick as a pinky finger. He handed it over and said, here you are. Changbajila took it, flipped through a few pages, and suddenly became furious. He raised his head and said angrily, Danba, I treated you as my best friend in vain. How dare you fool me with an incomplete copy of a souvenir? As he spoke, Changbajila threw the book to the ground and shouted, from now on, you are no longer my friend. Seeing that he was about to leave angrily, Danba hurriedly pulled him back and sighed, hey, don't be in such a hurry, I want to give you this book. Changbajila saw him take out a thread-bound book with a yellowish cover. He took it and flipped through a few pages. His face lit up with joy. That's it. Danba, thank you very much. Danba sighed, forget it, as long as you don't scold me. As he spoke, he squatted down, picked up the remnant book on the ground, and patted the dust off it. Changbajila was in a good mood, so he joked, why are you still boasting so cleanly? Aren't these books everywhere in your temple? Danba snorted. If you don't become the abbot, you won't know how much the monastery consumes. This book can still be sold. Changbajila smiled and shook his head. You really only care about money. By the way, aren't you going to see that Han guy with me? Are you leaving now? Danba had been forced by Changbajila to take away an extremely precious esoteric canon. At this time, he was depressed, and even his desire to see Li Yundong had diminished a lot. He said listlessly, lead the way. I'll go and have a look. Let's go. Changbajila laughed and carefully hid the book in his chest, then strode forward to lead the way. He walked as fast as he could, and his health surprised Danba. I know about Changbajila's health. Last year, he was sick. How did he become so healthy all of a sudden? Changbajila was afraid that Meidua wouldn't be able to stop Li Yundong, so he couldn't help but walk faster and faster. In the end, he was almost jogging. Although Danba was about the same age as him, he hadn't been soaked in Li Yundong's vigorous Yuanyang genuine qi, so he couldn't keep up with him. He could only keep shouting at Changbajila to slow down. After walking for a few minutes, Changbajila finally saw Li Yundong at a glance. He laughed happily from a distance and said, Han Gai, I'm here. When Li Yundong saw him, he also smiled. Meidua was sulking because Li Yundong hadn't talked to her. As soon as she saw Changbajila, she smiled happily and greeted him. Changbajila, have you finished talking? As she spoke, she unconsciously looked behind him and was suddenly stunned. Abbot Danba, why are you here? Abbot Danba was panting as he walked. He smiled and said, I came to see Qianba's savior. Is that him? Danba looked at Li Yundong, and Meiduo nodded with a smile. Yes, it's him. Danba was shocked when he saw him. He thought to himself, this Han man's eyes are bright and sharp like a knife. Moreover, the power he exudes is no weaker than that of the guardian of the holy mountain. He's not an ordinary person. He's clearly a cultivator. I thought he was just an ordinary person who was proficient in medicine. I didn't think he could understand the cultivation book of the esoteric sect, so I agreed. Why did Qianba want to give him the Mahamudra Secret Method Sutra? Nonsense, it's really nonsense. But he had already promised to give the Mahamudra Secret Method Sutra to Qianba, so it was not appropriate for him to ask for it back. He could only hope that Li Yundong would refuse so that he could ask for it back. Go to the internet. Changba Jila didn't know what Danba was thinking. He walked up to Li Yundong and enthusiastically introduced them to each other. This is my good friend, Master Danba, the abbot of the Kathuo Temple. Danba, this is my savior, Li Yundong. Li Yundong nodded with a smile, and Danba also forced a smile and put his palms together in return. Changba Jila took out the Mahamudra Secret Method Sutra from his bosom and respectfully handed it to Li Yundong with both hands. He said seriously, Han boy, this is a little token of my appreciation. Please accept it. Li Yundong was stunned. He saw that it was a thread-bound book with a Buddha statue on the cover and a line of golden Sanskrit characters. He muttered in his heart, what is this? Should I accept it? Isn't it popular among Tibetans to give hada? Meiduo, who was standing to one side, saw his hesitation and advised, Han brother, just accept it. You saved Changba Jila's life, so it's not a big deal to accept this little gift. If you don't accept it, Changba Jila will be very sad. Li Yundong glanced at her and felt that it might not be a precious gift, so he nodded with a smile and accepted it. Danba was going crazy watching from the side. He wanted to beat his chest and stamp his feet. Meiduo, why are you so talkative? Do you know what that is? Seeing Li Yundong accept it, Danba stuffed it into his bosom without looking at it, looking as if he didn't take it seriously. He was even more resentful in his heart. This kind of esoteric method is hard to get, but you actually treat it as weeds on the side of the road and don't take it seriously at all. Damn it. But on second thought, he thought, well, since you don't take it seriously, that's even better. When I find a chance to take it back, you won't be very sad. Danba made up his mind. He smiled and chatted with Li Yundong for a while, then found an opportunity to say goodbye and return to his room. After returning to his room, Danba called over a patrolling lama who had passed by the house and said, go and get Dorji Tenzin for me. The lama nodded and turned to leave. After a while, a tall monk dressed in a yellow and red lama robe strode in. The monk's robe exposed his left hand, where the muscles were bulging, and his skin glowed like steel under the moonlight. The village chief's hair grew on his head, each strand like a steel nail. He had tiger eyes and a lion's nose, and his appearance was extremely fierce. When Dorji Tenzin saw Danba, who was 2 heads shorter than him, he bowed respectfully and said, Abbot Danba, what can I do for you? Danba told him the whole story, sighed, and said, I thought that he was just a Han man who was proficient in medicine. I thought that even if I gave him the book, he wouldn't be able to understand it. But I never expected that this person would turn out to be a cultivator from the Central Plains. If such a person gets the book of our esoteric sect, he must be like a fish in water, like a tiger with wings. This is a big deal, and it may endanger the safety of our esoteric sect in the future. Dorji Tenzin raised his head and asked, Abbot Danba, do you want me to kill that person? Danba quickly shook his head and said, no, no, we are all monks. How can we commit such a sin that will send us to hell? I'm also at fault in this matter. I shouldn't have agreed to Changba's request. Just help me get this book back. Dorji Tenzin nodded. There was no expression on his face, and his eyebrows were as deep as the sea. He didn't ask about the strength of his opponent, so he nodded and said, okay, I understand. As he spoke, he turned around and was about to leave. Danba hurriedly stopped him and warned, don't act rashly. You must wait until he is separated from Changba and the others. You must not let Changba know. Do you understand? Dorji Tenzin nodded, but Danba still felt a little worried. He said, "By the way, although you are the guardian of our Kathuo monastery and one of the 18 guardian Vajras of the Holy Mountain, don't underestimate your opponent. Don't kill him, don't hurt him. Just take the scripture back. If he is willing to return it himself, that will be even better. Do you understand?" Dorji Tenzin frowned slightly and asked, "What if he refuses?" Danba sighed and said, "If he refuses, then we can only rob him." Dorji Tenzin nodded and said, "I understand. Abbot Danba, is there anything else? If not, I'll leave first." Danba smiled and said, "Go and have a rest. It's all right." When the night passed, Danba woke up. He wanted to ask Changbajila about the route of their pilgrimage, but when he arrived at the residence of Changbajila and the others, he found that they had set off early in the morning before the sky had even brightened. Danba was about to ask the Lama next to him to find Dorji Tenzin and ask him to catch up with them quickly, but he suddenly found that the Lamas in the temple were pointing at a stone that was as tall as a person next to the temple. Some tourists who had come to burn incense early in the morning were constantly marveling at the stone, and some were even scrambling to take pictures next to it. Danba walked over curiously and asked, "What are you looking at?" One of the Lamas turned around and saw that it was Abbot Danba. He immediately saluted and said, "Abbot Danba, come and see, it's so strange here." Danba took a look and saw that the stone, which was carved with scriptures, had a clear fist mark, and the outline of the fist was as clear as if it had been cut by a machine. Danba sucked in a breath of cold air. "Who did this?" A Lama said, "I don't know. I passed by here yesterday evening when the temple was closed. It was still fine." Mima, the monk who had been patrolling last night, suddenly said, "By the way, it seems that only Changbajila, Meiduo, and that Han man stayed here last night." "That Han man?" Danba was shocked. He quickly leaned forward and looked at the fist mark carefully. The more he looked at it, the more shocked he became. A few Lamas next to him said with a smile, "Last night, I heard from Meiduo that this fist mark was made by that Han man, and it was made from a distance of 3 meters. A Lama shook his head and said, "Making such a fist mark from 3 meters away? That's impossible, absolutely impossible. Even Dorji Tenzin couldn't have done it." Another Lama said with a smile, "Meiduo is a child. She likes to exaggerate." The Lama who had spoken first laughed and said, "That's right. I said I didn't believe it, but she was so angry that she almost fell out with me." The Lamas laughed and chatted, but Danba's heart was pounding when he heard them. He was shocked. Although Dorji Tenzin is the guardian of the temple, he can't make such a fist mark on this stone from 3 meters away. What is the background of this Han man? Why is he so powerful? Danba suddenly thought of something and hurriedly shouted, "By the way, where is Dorji Tenzin? Hurry up and find him for me." A Lama immediately said with a smile, "Abbot Danba, Dorji Tenzin left early in the morning. It seems that he left with Changbajila, Meiduo, and the others." Danba's face suddenly turned ashen. His body swayed and he almost fell to the ground. He cried in his heart, "Dorji Tenzin is definitely no match for this Han man. What should I do?" Last week, he was ranked 8th on the flower list. This week, he had 3 breakouts. It was still the same as before, /om/. Chapter 177. Go to watch net. Early in the morning, Li Yundong followed Changbajila and the others in the direction of Snow Mountain Meiduo. There were old people like Changbajila in their 70s and 80s, and there were also young people like Meiduo, who were 17 or 18 years old. The members were very complicated, but all of them were very devout, and their preparations for this pilgrimage were very perfect. Go to watch net. 7 km. Li Yundong found that some of them not only carried pots and pans on their backs, but also a whole set of knives. Meiduo said that this was to guard against wolves and also to hunt wild animals to improve their meals. Pilgrims could not drive motor vehicles, as it was not devout, but some of them drove carriages and ox carts pulled by yaks. The back of the carriages was spacious and flat, and all kinds of luggage were piled up. Some people who could not walk would also get on the carriages to rest for a while. At first, Li Yundong refused the invitation of Chambajila and the others. He did not sit on the carriages, but just walked with the large group. Li Yundong's existence made the Tibetan boys in this group full of a sense of crisis and vigilance, especially since Meiduo would come to Li Yundong from time to time, intentionally or unintentionally. This made the young people among them who were interested in Meiduo feel jealous. However, Li Yundong was Chambajila's savior, so it was not appropriate for them to say anything more. They just held back their anger in their hearts and wanted to wear down this Han man on the journey. In their impression, Han people were all weak. As soon as they quickened their pace, the speed of the procession also increased. Some of the old, young, women, and children secretly complained in their hearts. At first, Meiduo could still grit her teeth and persist, but later, she really couldn't hold on anymore. She got into the carriage and watched the young Tibetans in the procession sandwiched Li Yundong in the middle, secretly competing with him. At first, Meiduo was secretly worried. Although she knew that Li Yundong was an ascetic monk, her young compatriots were all good at long-distance running. Moreover, this was the plateau, and many Han people would have altitude sickness here. She really did not know how long Li Yundong could last. But Li Yundong had run all the way to Tibet, and he had already trained his body to be as strong as iron. His internal organs had also been polished like fine steel. How could he be afraid of them? After a few days, the Tibetans were all worn down and could not hold on any longer. They got into the car one after another. Only Li Yundong was full of energy and walked as if he was flying. Watch net. Hongom Meiduo sat on the handcart and looked at Li Yundong with admiration. You said that you walked here from more than 2,000 kilometers away. I didn't believe it at first, but now I do. You're really amazing. I've seen so many people, but I've never seen anyone who can walk like you. Li Yundong looked at her with a smile and said, correct me. I didn't walk here. Meiduo smiled and said, have you ever taken a bus like us? Li Yundong shook his head and smiled. No, I ran all the way here. The smile on Meiduo's face suddenly disappeared, and she said in horror, what? Did you run here? Li Yundong smiled and said, of course, there's no need to run. How long would it take me to walk such a long distance? Can't you see that I'm barefoot? My shoes are ruined. Meiduo looked at Li Yundong in awe and said with shock in her eyes, you're really amazing. Li Yundong smiled and didn't say anything. Meiduo looked at Li Yundong with admiration for a while. Suddenly, her heart skipped a beat. Was this Han brother just hinting at me to make a pair of shoes for him? As she said this, she looked at Li Yundong's feet and saw that they were bare and covered with thick calluses. She nodded to herself and said with certainty in her heart, well, it must be like this. Thinking of this, she rolled her eyes, jumped out of the carriage, and ran to the end of the line. She found an old lady and said, Puchamutashi, do you have a needle and thread here? Can you lend it to me? The old Tibetan woman was following the motorcade, turning the sutra cylinder and reciting scriptures. When she heard Meiduo's voice, she stopped and said with a smile, do you want to sew something? I have it. Let me find it. After that, she went to her handcart and rummaged through the package for a while. Then, she found a red sewing box and handed it over. Watch net. Meiduo took it with a face full of joy. Puchamutashi, thank you so much. I'll give it back to you when I'm done. As she said this, she quickly ran to the front of the line like a little swallow. Puchamutashi looked at Meiduo smiling so happily. As someone who had been through this, how could she not know what she was thinking? She shook her head with a smile, sighed, and said, "It seems that our Maidwa's heart is no longer here." An old lady beside her also smiled and said, "Yes, her heart has already flown over the snow mountain." Puchimutashi looked at Maidwa's back lovingly. "May the god of the snow mountain bless her." Meiduo asked for a needle and thread from Puchimutashi, then asked for a pair of shawls and cloth from someone else. Then, she made a pair of cloth shoes according to her own visual judgment. Her hands were dexterous, and she finished it in one day. The next day, she ran to Li Yundong like she was presenting a treasure. She handed over the neatly sewn cloth shoes nervously and expectantly, saying shyly and boldly, "Here, try it on and see if it fits your feet." In the process of dealing with Li Yundong, Meiduo had also become smarter. She didn't ask Li Yundong whether he accepted it or not. Instead, she directly asked him to wear it and asked if it fit his feet. Such a closed-door question made it impossible for Li Yundong to refuse. Li Yundong looked at the pair of simple but neatly made cloth shoes that Meiduo had handed over with some surprise. He smiled and said, "Did you make them?" Meiduo's cheeks were a little red. She nodded, and the hand that was holding the cloth shoes began to tremble slightly. She was very afraid that Li Yundong would not take the pair of cloth shoes. If that happened, she would die of shame. The eyes of the Tibetan boys on the side turned red. Meiduo was the goddess in their hearts. They were afraid of offending her and making her unhappy, but this Han man was even hesitant to accept Meiduo's good intentions. It was really hateful. Li Yundong hesitated for a moment. Seeing that it was Meiduo's kindness and that he really didn't have any shoes to wear, he readily took it and put it on his feet. He tried it on and found that the size was just right. When Meiduo saw Li Yundong take it, her heart immediately fell back into her chest. She let out a long breath and smiled. "Is it comfortable?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "It's comfortable. It fits my feet very well. Your craftsmanship is good." Meiduo was a little proud. "Of course, I have many other crafts. Do you want to see them in the future?" There was a hint of caution in her words, but at this time, Li Yundong was only thinking about cultivation. In his spare time, he was also thinking about Su Chan. How could he pay attention to such a little girl's thoughts? Li Yundong smiled casually and said, "Okay." Meiduo's heart thumped wildly. She was both happy and happy. Did he agree to do it with me? Meiduo's face was flushed. For a moment, she couldn't suppress her shyness. With a cry, she turned her head and ran in the direction of the rear of the convoy. The long and thin braids on her head danced in the air. Li Yundong looked at her with a puzzled expression, then shook his head with a smile. He had been following these Tibetans all the way. Although he was walking at a fast pace, he always felt that his speed was too slow. He was bored for a while, and it was not convenient for him to practice Qigong while walking, so he remembered the thread-bound book that Chambajila had given him before. Li Yundong took it out of his arms and opened it to read to pass the time. But when he looked at it, Li Yundong was suddenly stunned. On the first page of the thread-bound book, there were 2 lines of golden words, in Sanskrit and Tibetan. Li Yundong opened it and read a few more pages. He suddenly smiled bitterly. The book was full of Sanskrit and Tibetan, without a single Chinese character. How could he read it? Li Yundong was unwilling to give up and turned a few more pages. He found that it was full of Sanskrit and Tibetan characters. The Tibetan characters were large, and the Sanskrit characters were small. When Li Yundong turned to the last few pages, he found that there were all kinds of handprints in the book. Li Yundong was curious and couldn't help but raise his head and glance around. He found Meiduo in the team and walked toward her. When Meiduo saw Li Yundong coming over, she couldn't help but feel nervous and expectant. She was uneasy, her eyes flashing, and she didn't know where to put her hands and feet. But Li Yundong came over, handed her the thread-bound book, and said with a smile, "Can you translate it for me?" Meiduo was very disappointed, but she couldn't show it. She could only take the thread-bound book and take a look. With just one glance, she was shocked and said, "This is the Mahamudra Secret Method Sutra. Changbajila actually gave you this classic?" Li Yundong asked in confusion, "Is it very precious?" Meiduo said with a serious face, "This is the most precious treasure of the Kathuo temple. It records the cultivation method of the esoteric Mahamudra." Li Yundong was shocked. "Then give it back to me quickly. I'll return it to Changbajila. How can I accept such a precious thing?" Meiduo secretly regretted saying, "Why did I say this? Since Changbajila wanted to give it to me, why did I say anything?" She laughed dryly and explained, "Of course, it used to be the most precious treasure of the temple, but now it's not necessarily so. Now the Kathuo temple has even begun to sell it as a tourist souvenir." Li Yundong was stunned, but then he thought, the inner canon of the Yellow Emperor, the supreme cultivation book of the Taoists, is being sold openly in Xinhua bookstore. Why can't the most precious treasure of the esoteric sect be sold? Thinking of this, Li Yundong felt relieved and no longer insisted on his idea. "Then can you translate it for me? It's like reading a heavenly book to me." Meiduo wanted to say, "Well, wait for me to translate it next to the book, and then I'll give it to you." But when these words were on the tip of her tongue, Meiduo's heart skipped a beat. She smiled and said, "Then why don't you get on the handcart with me and I'll translate it for you?" When the two of them sat on the handcart, they would inevitably be very close to each other. Moreover, the carriage was shaking, so they would inevitably touch each other. When Meiduo thought of how close they would be, she couldn't help but feel her ears heat up. She thought to herself, "Will he agree?" Li Yundong didn't know what she was thinking, so he immediately agreed with a smile. "Okay." When Meiduo heard this, she was overjoyed. He agreed. Then, does that mean he really likes me, /om/. Chapter 178. Go to watch net. Meiduo and Li Yundong sat on the cart that was moving slowly. Although the road was long, Meiduo translated the words in the Mahamudra Secret Method Sutra to Li Yundong word by word. It could be considered that she had found something to do. Li Yundong memorized the words that Meiduo had translated while thinking about the meaning in his heart. He didn't feel that time was passing slowly. Go to watch net. According to Meiduo's translation, the book was divided into 3 volumes and 3 parts. The first volume was the Ganges Mahamudra, which recorded the cultivation methods of the 3 Mahamudra, the Komla Mahamudra, and the Light Mahamudra. After Meiduo finished translating the volume, Li Yundong fell into deep thought. Although the first volume introduced the 3 kinds of Mahamudra, in fact, it was more about the cultivation of Buddhism and the cultivation techniques of Buddhism. It did not involve the most critical problem, the problem of fighting. Cultivation was the same as martial arts. There were 3 different levels: talking, practicing, and fighting. Some people were just good at talking and fooling others. Instead, they became high officials of the sports commission and had disciples all over the world. However, this kind of person only talked but did not practice. They had no kung fu at all, let alone actual combat. There were also some people who only knew how to practice, and what they practiced was kung fu for health. The reason why martial arts were the quintessence of the country was not how strong their fighting skills were, but that it was the only fighting skill in the world that combined health and fighting skills. Some masters lacked fighting experience. They were very good at practicing, but once they entered the actual combat, they would not be able to do it. There were also some people who only knew how to fight. All their kung fu was developed in actual combat, and they were very powerful. However, people who knew how to fight could drown in the river and heroes who fell from the horse. If these people who knew how to fight did not know how to take care of themselves, it was easy for them to practice to death. Therefore, most of them did not live long. Along the way of cultivation, Li Yundong had thought about this problem many times. He found that at present, what he lacked the most was fighting skills. How should he fight when he met an enemy? In the past, when Li Yundong met Lin Youfa, he could still fight with him. But when he met Wan Hongling, if it weren't for the fact that the boy Yuanyang blood in his body happened to restrain her, he would have died at that time. Especially after meeting Ao Wushuang, he was even more shocked by her amazing magic. He had no idea how to deal with this kind of magic. Su Chan and Zi Yuan, the two women that Li Yundong had come into contact with, were both good at talking, practicing, and fighting. Li Yundong had a vague feeling in his heart that if he wanted to become a top master, he had to talk, practice, and fight. All three of these were indispensable. He wouldn't say that this was very difficult. Without a disciple, he wouldn't have any power, and he would be bullied by others. People couldn't always stand up for themselves, right? Not knowing how to cultivate meant that one's foundation was not solid enough. Even if one succeeded in building one's foundation, they would still be a fake core. If they encountered a strong opponent, they would be defeated in a single blow. If he didn't know how to fight, he would be useless. No matter how many disciples he had, no matter how solid his basic skills were, it would all be useless. If he didn't know how to block the opponent's attack, it would all be for naught. Only the combination of the three was the way of the king. At this time, Li Yundong already had a rough understanding of the way of cultivation. He could already speak clearly and logically, let alone practice. He had polished himself to the point that he was like well-tempered steel. The only thing he lacked now was fighting skills. When he got the Mahamudra Secret Method Sutra, Li Yundong thought it was something like a martial arts secret book at first, but after listening to Meiduo's translation for a long time, he was a little disappointed in his heart. Go to c. 7 K.O.M. In fact, the first volume of this book was similar to the Yellow Emperor's Canon of Internal Medicine. However, the Yellow Emperor's Canon of Internal Medicine explained the feasibility of cultivation from a medical point of view, while the first volume of this book explained the feasibility of Mahamudra cultivation from a Buddhist point of view. After Li Yundong digested the contents of the first volume, he asked Meiduo to start translating the contents of the second volume. The content of the second volume was even more limitless. It was all about the six-syllable Buddhist mantra. Although it was vivid, interesting, and thought-provoking, Li Yundong couldn't help but be more disappointed. When it came to the third volume, Meiduo suddenly raised her head, blinked her eyes, and said, "That's it." Li Yundong was stunned. "What's it?" Meiduo handed the book in her hand to him and said, "The remaining volume is full of paintings." Li Yundong took the book and looked at it. He saw that it was full of handprints, and under the handprints were a few lines of words, which were also bilingual in Sanskrit and Tibetan. Li Yundong pointed to the painting and asked, "What does it say?" Meiduo said, "This is the Mahavairokkana Mudra. Go to c. 7 K.O.M. Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat. He pointed to another painting and said, "What about this one?" Meiduo smiled and said, "This is the Mahavairokkana Mudra." Li Yundong looked at these handprints and suddenly couldn't help thinking, these handprints are so strange. Could it be that all the tricks of this book are in them? Thinking about this, he unconsciously began to imitate the handprints on them. Meiduo saw Li Yundong sitting cross-legged on the handcart, his 5 fingers flying. One moment, he made one handprint, and the next, he made another, from the Vajra Freedom Mudra to the Fixed Fundamental Mudra. His expression was solemn, and he really looked like a Buddhist disciple. She couldn't help but laugh and say, "You're doing a good job. It's quite similar." After pinching his fingers for a while, Li Yundong didn't feel anything unusual, nor did he feel that it was a kung fu for beating people. He couldn't help but feel a little strange, so he tilted his head and thought about something. After thinking for a while, he suddenly pointed to the words under the paintings and asked, "What does it say?" These words were very short and looked like one or two words in a foreign language. At first, Meiduo subconsciously ignored them. She looked at them for a while and said, "This is a Buddhist mantra." Li Yundong immediately asked, "What mantra?" Meiduo smiled and said, "Of course it's the 6-word mantra of Buddhism, Mani Mani Padme Hum." Li Yundong was stunned. He suddenly thought excitedly, could it be that each handprint corresponds to a Buddhist mantra? Li Yundong quickly asked, "Then what is the mantra under the Mahavairokkana Mudra?" Meiduo said, "It's the 6-word mantra of Buddhism." Li Yundong secretly noted it down in his heart. He had wanted to try the effect of this Mahamudra with the 6-word mantra now, but he looked around. At this time, the sky was getting dark, and there were too many people around, so he suppressed this idea. He just asked Meiduo to translate all the pictures and words correspondingly, and he memorized them by heart. The two of them whispered to each other in the cart, looking very intimate. Some young Tibetan boys who were interested in Meiduo were so jealous that their eyes turned red. One of the young men snorted coldly and said, "Are we just going to watch this Han man pick away our most precious and beautiful snow lotus?" Another young man said, "What else can you do? This Han man doesn't look like a young man. He's soft and easy to pinch. At first, we ran so fast, but we didn't wear him down. What can you do?" The young man who had spoken before snorted and said, "I'm going to challenge him tonight. I don't believe that he can beat me in wrestling." Tibetans and Mongolians were very similar in some ways. They both loved wrestling and wrestling very much. Men also regarded this kind of sport as the best way to prove their ability. If they could win in this aspect, it would be easy for them to win the favor of beautiful Tibetan girls. As soon as the young man finished speaking, the other young men also became excited. They whispered to each other and were ready to discuss how to teach this young man a lesson. While they were talking enthusiastically, Changbajila suddenly ran over from the front of the group and shouted, "Something happened ahead. Hurry up and help." Changbajila's prestige was extremely high. As soon as he spoke, the Tibetan young men followed him. Li Yundong, who was sitting in the back of the cart and secretly thinking about the mantra Mahamudra, saw this scene. He suddenly asked, "By the way, why do some of you call him Changbajila, but he calls himself Qiangba? Is his surname Qiangba, or is his surname Qiangba and his name Jela?" Meiduo giggled, and her voice was as moving as a silver bell. "We Tibetans don't have surnames, only names. Qiangba is his name, and Jela means old man. Sometimes the names of Tibetans are repeated, so we add one or two other words at the back or front to distinguish them." Li Yundong laughed and said, "I see. What about you? What does Meiduo mean?" Meiduo's cheeks were slightly red, and she said proudly, "Meiduo means the flowers blooming on the plateau." Li Yundong smiled and said, "You deserve this name." Meiduo looked at Li Yundong with burning eyes and asked, "Really? Do you think I'm beautiful?" Li Yundong was suddenly moved by Meiduo's gaze. For the first time, he realized Meiduo's affection for him. He muttered to himself, "This girl, is she interested in me?" Li Yundong didn't want to respond to Meiduo's enthusiasm. He changed the topic, pointed to a group of people not far away, and said, "What's going on over there?" Meiduo was a little disappointed. She straightened up, looked up, and said, "I don't know, but won't we know when we go over and have a look?" As she said this, she boldly grabbed Li Yundong's hand, jumped out of the car, and said to him with a smile, "Hurry up, let's go to the front and have a look." Li Yundong hadn't expected Meiduo to be so bold. He subconsciously pulled back, but Meiduo's hand was clenched so tightly that he couldn't move it. He was too embarrassed to force it out again, for fear of hurting this young and beautiful girl. The two of them held hands and ran forward quickly. When the Tibetans saw them holding hands, they began to whisper to each other. However, Meiduo ignored the surrounding gazes and squeezed into the crowd with Li Yundong. Li Yundong took a closer look and saw that it was a jeep. The rear wheel was deeply stuck in a muddy pit. Two foreigners were pushing the car hard in front of it, and a group of Tibetan young men were pushing the car hard behind it. Beside this group of people stood a beautiful black-haired woman. It was Lu Xia, the Chinese tour guide he had met once before. It's them. Li Yundong was stunned for a moment and recognized the two foreigners. It was summer on the Qinghai, Tibet plateau, and the road was not well repaired. For some reason, the jeep had gotten stuck in the muddy pit on the side of the road. No matter how hard the Tibetan young men and the two foreigners tried, the jeep could not be pushed out. Meiduo couldn't help but say to Li Yundong, "Why don't you go and help?" Li Yundong nodded. Okay. When the Tibetan young men who were pushing the car saw Meiduo holding Li Yundong's hand tightly, they immediately became jealous. When Li Yundong came over, they stood up at the same time and stopped pushing. They all stepped aside, wanting to let Li Yundong push the car alone and see him make a fool of himself. /om/ Chapter 179. Go to watch net. When Meiduo saw that these people were making things difficult for Li Yundong, she couldn't help but be furious. However, she couldn't speak ill of her own people in front of so many outsiders. She just felt indignant and worried for Li Yundong, for fear that he would be embarrassed. Go to watch net. 7 Instead, he nodded and smiled at these Tibetans in a friendly manner. Then he took a deep breath, and a stream of qi surged up from his dantian. He lifted the chassis of the jeep with both hands, and with a loud shout, he lifted the car with both hands. The surrounding crowd suddenly let out a shocked uproar. The two foreigners were stunned until Li Yundong shouted at them, "Hey, what are you waiting for?" Only then did they react and push the car in front of them. The rear tire of the jeep was no longer stuck in the pit. With a push from the two foreigners, the car was pushed forward. Li Yundong also carried the car through the mud pit, and then put it down. His face did not change, and his heart did not beat fast. Lu Xia, who was standing to one side, took off the big sunglasses on her face in shock and looked at Li Yundong with her mouth agape, as if she couldn't believe that this disheveled and sloppily dressed man had such divine strength. *CK, it's impossible, isn't it? Lu Xia said, stuttering. The foreigner beside her also said with a face full of shock, "It's amazing, it's really amazing. I didn't expect to meet this amazing Chinese man here. Lu, are all the people in your country so amazing?" At this time, Lu Xia was speechless. For the first time, he had touched an old man who had been diagnosed as dead with his hand and saved him. The second time was even more exaggerated. So many young and strong men had pushed a cart, but it had not been pushed out of the mud pit. However, Li Yundong had pushed the cart out of the mud pit alone. If he wasn't a god, what was he? Not only Lu Xia, but all the Tibetans who saw this scene regarded Li Yundong as a celestial being for a moment. Those young Tibetans who had tried to challenge Li Yundong at night looked at each other with horror and fear in their eyes. "Duo Gu, do you still want to challenge him? Are you kidding me? He's so strong. How can he compete with him? Where did this guy come from? He's too strong. Yeah, he's like a reincarnated King Kong. He's amazing." When Li Yundong returned to Meiduo, her face was also flushed with excitement. Her eyes were full of worship and admiration. She kept shouting, "Mahagala, Mahagala." Li Yundong smiled in confusion and said, "What are you talking about?" When Meiduo saw that Li Yundong was in the limelight, and that some of her compatriots, who had been very resistant to him before, were now convinced and looking at him with fear in their eyes. She became more and more proud and happy, as if she had done something amazing. She said with a smile, Mahagala means guardian Vitra. It means that you are very strong. Li Yundong laughed and said, it's just a small trick. But the Mahamudra you translated for me may be the real amazing Kung Fu. At this time, the sky had gradually darkened. The two foreigners who were climbing the mountain did not continue their journey. They also stayed in the temporary camp of the Tibetan people. Watch net. Rainbow ** literature _learning% super #speed. Update. The Tibetans were hospitable. When they saw outsiders, they warmly took out their own brewed Highland barley wine and cheese to entertain them. The Westerners were also open-minded, unlike the Eastern Han, who were introverted. After the two of them drank a bowl of wine, they immediately shouted and became very happy. Some of the Tibetans even surrounded the bonfire and sang and danced. Of course, the one who attracted the most attention at the banquet was Meiduo. After dancing a few times in the field, she suddenly found that Li Yundong did not attend the bonfire party. Curious, she found an excuse and walked toward the tent that the Tibetans had temporarily set up for Li Yundong. When Meiduo lifted the curtain of Li Yundong's tent, she suddenly lifted the curtain like a prank and shouted, "What are you doing?" But as soon as she finished speaking, her face fell because Li Yundong was not in the tent. Meiduo was very disappointed and muttered in her heart, "Where on earth did this Han brother go? Why didn't he come to such a lively party? What a disappointment." Just as she was about to turn around and leave, she suddenly heard a low voice coming from afar. The voice was vague and indistinct. Meiduo was shocked. Why does it sound so much like a wolf? Wolves were not uncommon on the Qinghai, Tibet plateau. Meiduo immediately became nervous and vigilant. She turned around and ran quickly to Chambajila, whispering, "Chambajila, I think I heard the sound of a wolf." Chambajila was not only a devout believer, but also an old hunter. When he heard this, he immediately became vigilant and narrowed his eyes. "Where is it? Take me to have a look." As the spiritual leader of this group of people, he moved and attracted the attention of the others. Someone immediately asked, "Chambajila, what happened?" Chambajila laughed and said, "It seems that there are wolf cubs coming. Everyone, be alert and take out your shotguns." At this time, no one was in the mood to sing and dance. They stood up one after another. For a moment, the men rushed into the tent to get their own shotguns and weapons, and the women also held long knives and iron pots in their hands. No one was empty. Go to watch net. 7 KOM. After listening to Lu Xia's translation, the two foreigners saw that they were going to fight wolves, so they were very excited and wanted to follow them to watch the fun. The group of people ran noisily toward the place that Meiduo had mentioned. Before they had taken a few steps, Chambajila turned his head and said angrily, "Be quiet. I want to beat a wolf to improve my diet. What if you scare the wolf away by shouting so loudly?" Everyone immediately burst into laughter and shut their mouths one after another. The group walked forward 100 or 200 meters, and sure enough, they heard a low voice. The sound came with the wind, and everyone listened carefully. They whispered to each other, "Hey, it doesn't sound like a wolf." "Meiduo, did you hear it wrong?" Meiduo blushed and said, "I clearly heard a wolf just now." Chambajila waved his hand and said in a low voice, "Don't quarrel. Let's go and have a look." The group walked forward dozens of meters. They didn't see the wolf, but they saw a figure sitting on the grass in the distance, shining with a faint golden light. Chambajila was shocked and motioned for everyone to stop talking. He walked forward another 10 meters. This time, Chambajila recognized that the person who had made the sound that Meiduo had misunderstood was Li Yundong, the Han man. At this time, Li Yundong was sitting cross-legged in the wilderness. He made a vajra fist with both hands. The index finger of his left hand was straight, and the little finger of his right hand was wrapped around the first joint of his left index finger, while the end of his left index finger was supported by the first joint of his right thumb. This was the Vairocana Mudra of the Mahamudra. The Buddha believed that the left hand represented the 5 great bodies of all living beings, and the right hand represented the guest crown of the 5 wisdom and 5 Buddhas. The guest crown was placed in the shape of the mudra of all living beings, so it was called the Great Wisdom Fist Mudra. Therefore, the Vairocana Mudra was also called the Wisdom Fist Mudra. Li Yundong made this kind of mudra, but in his heart, he was thinking about the profound meaning of the Vairocana Mudra. Bodhi guides the first wisdom mudra, the Vairocana Mudra of the great sun Dharma realm, which can destroy all darkness. The true qi in his body flowed and rushed to the top of his head. Li Yundong suddenly felt as if someone had patted his forehead. The Baihui acupoint on the top of his head was opened, and then a cool feeling went straight down from the top of his head, as if someone was enlightening him. Li Yundong only felt that the 6-syllable mantra in his mind was unconsciously echoing, as if there were countless vajras and thousands of arhats chanting scriptures at the same time. The mantra of the Vairocana Mudra subconsciously jumped out of the scriptures all over the sky and turned into a shining golden word, Mudra. Li Yundong only felt that as soon as this word jumped out of his mind, the qi in his body seemed to have gone out of control, gushing toward the Mudra. He unconsciously spat out a word in a low voice, Mudra. With this shout, the faint golden light emitted from Li Yundong's body suddenly became more vigorous. Then he pushed the handprint in his hand forward, and suddenly a golden handprint of Vairocana Mahavairakana flew straight out. It grew bigger and bigger in the dark night, and finally disappeared into the distant night sky. Changbajila was stunned, and his heart was shaking wildly. He was more and more sure that Li Yundong was the reincarnation of Mahagala. He looked back and saw that the clansmen were also staring at Li Yundong, who was not far away, with their mouths agape. They saw that every time Li Yundong whispered a mantra, he would spit out a golden handprint. This golden mudra was as clear as a movie projection. It was shining with golden light, and it was as majestic as the Buddha. Li Yundong hadn't gone to the party before because he wanted to confirm what he had thought during the day. As soon as he confirmed it, it was just as he had imagined. This mudra really needed to be matched with the mantra to be effective. But what Li Yundong didn't know was that in fact, this Mahamudra and mantra could only be used by cultivators with strong Jinchi in order to have the power to subdue demons. Li Yundong was originally a Taoist cultivator, but the first fighting method he had inadvertently learned was Buddhist Kung Fu. This had to be said to be a joke of fate. Changbajila and the others watched as Li Yunyang struck out one Mahamudra after another. The dark sky seemed to be illuminated by his golden Mahamudra. They were so shocked that they trembled all over. Unable to control themselves, they immediately knelt on the ground and prostrated themselves in worship. It wasn't until Li Yundong made the 18th Mahamudra that he felt that his Jinchi was a little weak, so he stopped. After running his qi for a while, he slowly stood up. When Li Yundong stood up and turned his head, he was shocked to see a large group of people kneeling not far behind him. These people were worshipping him as if they were worshipping a god. Li Yundong walked over, pulled Meiduo up, and asked in a low voice, "What are you doing?" Meiduo stared at Li Yundong with her big flashing eyes. She said with awe and worship, "Are you really the reincarnation of Mahagala?" Li Yundong smiled bitterly and said, "What nonsense are you talking about?" Meiduo said excitedly, "Don't deny it. We all saw it just now. You must be the reincarnation of Mahagala, right?" Li Yundong shook his head and said, "No, absolutely not." Seeing that he was denying it so completely and firmly, Meiduo couldn't help but feel a little surprised and doubtful. A Tibetan who didn't understand their Chinese couldn't help but urge them anxiously, "Meiduo, what are you talking about? Meiduo turned to her clansmen and said, "He said that he is not the reincarnation of Mahagala." The clansmen whispered to each other, "How could he not be the reincarnation of Mahagala?" By the way, the Han people may not understand the meaning of Mahagala in our Tibetan language. Meiduo, can you explain to him what Mahagala means? Meiduo said loudly, "I've explained it, but he just won't admit it." There was obvious disappointment on the faces of these Tibetan people. They said one after another, "Impossible, this person must be our guardian Vajra. I've never seen anyone use the Mahamudra like this. If he's not the guardian Vajra, then what is he?" "Not necessarily. This person is Han, and there are also Buddhists among the Han people, but they are different from us. They are not called Vajra, but Arhat. This kind of ability is also called Shintong. I think he is the Shintong Arhat of the Han people. No matter what he is, this person is definitely here to protect us. Otherwise, why would he meet us? Why did he save Chambajila? We have to try our best to keep him here." "Keep him here? How? He's a Han from the Central Plains. What can we do to keep him here?" "Actually, it's not impossible to keep this Han person." As everyone was talking, a thought suddenly flashed through their minds, and their eyes fell on Meiduo. == The third update, /om/. Chapter 180. Go to watch net. When Meiduo saw that everyone's eyes were on her, her heart was as clear as a mirror. Her face suddenly turned red. She stamped her feet in shame and annoyance and said angrily, "Why are you all looking at me?" As she spoke, she covered her face, turned around, and ran away. Watch net. 7:ko/ As the Tibetans watched Meiduo leave, they all burst into laughter. They knew that Li Yundong didn't understand Tibetan, so they said to Chambajila unscrupulously, "Chambajila, you have to find a way to persuade Meiduo." Chambajila laughed and kept stroking his white beard with his hand. "There's no need for me to persuade her. Meiduo is more impatient than we are." After saying that, the crowd burst into laughter. At this time, Meiduo, who was running back to the camp, became even more shy when she heard the laughter coming from the wind. She covered her face with her hands, and her cheeks were so red that it looked as if they were about to bleed. However, her big sparkling eyes were full of passion and expectation. Li Yundong couldn't understand what they were saying, but he was not stupid. Seeing that these people's eyes were full of admiration and awe, as well as a cunning light, as if they were plotting against him, he muttered in his heart, "What are these guys laughing at?" Chambajila saw that Li Yundong was a little embarrassed under everyone's gaze, so he waved his hand and said, "Well, go back to sleep. We still have to hurry up early tomorrow morning." Only then did the crowd disperse. After pointing at Li Yundong for a while, the two foreigners and the Chinese tour guide also returned to their tents. Li Yundong hadn't expected that his practice in the wilderness would alarm so many people. He secretly made up his mind that before he found a suitable place to start the Zhuji phase, he would never do such a shocking thing again. Li Yundong returned to his tent and slept for the night. At dawn, he heard the sound of chants, the sound of whips lashing the cows and horses, and the loud shouts of people coming from the camp. Among them, the loudest and clearest was the voice of a girl singing loudly. Although she was singing in Tibetan and Li Yundong couldn't understand it, the melody was high and melodious, making Li Yundong feel relaxed and happy. He couldn't help but praise it in his heart. After getting out of the tent, Li Yundong saw that the Tibetans were busy tearing down the tents and packing them up on the ox carts and carriages. When some of the Tibetans saw Li Yundong, they were no longer as vigilant and cautious as before. They all smiled and greeted Li Yundong warmly. There were also some old Tibetan women who enthusiastically served him hot milk wine and highland barley cakes. Li Yundong was infected by their enthusiasm. He smiled and drank the milk wine in one gulp, then ate a few highland barley cakes. Suddenly, these Tibetans smiled happily and treated Li Yundong even more warmly. Watch net. 7 K.O.M. Some of these Tibetans had started their annual pilgrimage when they were in their teens, so they were very familiar with the work. In less than 30 minutes, the whole team was ready to set off. Li Yundong followed the convoy. As he walked slowly, he secretly held all kinds of Mahamudra that he had practiced the day before. Seeing him like this, the Tibetans beside him whispered to each other, not daring to disturb him. Only Meiduo kept singing like a happy lark in the team, as if there was something happy in her heart. Changbajila rode an old horse and listened for a long time. He heard Meiduo singing in Tibetan, "My beloved, if she were my lifelong companion, it would be like fishing up a treasure from the bottom of the sea." He suddenly turned his horse in front of the team, walked up to Meiduo, and said with a smile, "Meiduo, you usually look very smart. Why are you so stupid today?" Meiduo looked at Changbajila in confusion and blinked. "Changbajila, what are you talking about? How am I stupid?" Changbajila laughed and said, "Your Han brother doesn't understand a single word of Tibetan. How can he understand all the Tibetan songs you sing?" Meiduo blushed and said with some dissatisfaction, "But I can't sing in Chinese." Changbajila winked and said, "You can translate the Tibetan into Chinese and then sing it." Meiduo was a little shy. "But what if I don't sing well and get laughed at?" Changbajila laughed and said, "You can just go to him and sing for him alone. We won't listen. Isn't that fine?" Meiduo rolled her eyes and said with a smile, "That's a good idea." As she spoke, she jumped off the cart and ran in the direction of Li Yundong. Changbajila couldn't help laughing. Looking at Meiduo's slim and energetic back, his smile was full of love. "Han brother." Meiduo ran up to Li Yundong like a happy bird, looked at him with joy and expectation, and said, "Can I sing for you?" Li Yundong loosened his fingers that were pinching the Mahamudra and looked at Meiduo with a smile. "Didn't I tell you to call my name? Calling me Han brother sounds weird. By the way, weren't you singing just now?" Meiduo's cheeks were slightly red, but her eyes looked at Li Yundong boldly and wildly. "Can you understand the lyrics?" Li Yundong shook his head with a smile. "I don't understand a word. Go to the internet." 7 K.O.M. Meiduo smiled and said, "Then I'll translate it into Chinese and sing it for you, okay?" Li Yundong said curiously, "You can sing it in Chinese? Well, sing it for me." Meiduo cleared her throat and deliberately waited for the people around them to walk to the front. The two of them slowly fell behind the crowd. After a long distance, she began to sing, "I ask the Buddha, why does it always snow when I'm sad? The Buddha says, winter is about to pass. Leave some memories. I ask the Buddha, why does it always snow on a night when I don't care? The Buddha says, people always miss a lot of real beauty when they're not paying attention. I ask the Buddha, will it snow again in a few days? The Buddha says, don't just focus on this season and miss this winter." Meiduo's voice was clear and melodious. She sang this philosophical and highly suggestive love song, which was melodious and melodious. Li Yundong felt that all the sounds in the vast world had disappeared, leaving only Meiduo's moving voice lingering in the air for 3 days. After Meiduo finished singing, she boldly glanced at Li Yundong. She saw that Li Yundong's expression changed and his eyes were fixed on the front, as if he was thinking about something. Meiduo asked tentatively, "Didn't I sing well?" Only then did Li Yundong come to his senses and say repeatedly, "You sang well. You sang so well that I was a little fascinated." Meiduo was overjoyed. "Do you like the song I sang?" Li Yundong glanced at Meiduo and saw that she was staring at him. He was too familiar with this kind of gaze. Wasn't this the kind of gaze that the little girl often looked at him with? This kind of gaze was full of worship and love. Only a girl who had fallen in love would have such a gaze. Li Yundong's heart trembled. He suddenly understood, I'm afraid that this girl really likes me. In the past, Li Yundong might have been secretly proud of himself, but now he was a little worried. This time, he had come to Tibet specifically for Zhu Jifei's cultivation. In order to clear his mind and restrain his desires, Li Yundong had even sold his mobile phone, which could be used to contact Su Chan. He was afraid that he would not be able to bear the pain of lovesickness and be entangled with the little girl on the phone again. But Li Yundong had never expected that in the end, he would still be in love again. What should I do? Li Yundong couldn't help but smile bitterly in his heart. He had an idea and deliberately changed the topic. Well, your singing is really nice. Can you sing a few more? Seeing that Li Yundong liked it, Meiduo was so happy that she began to sing again. Her voice was very good, and she could use her qi. After singing for 2 hours in a row, she didn't feel tired at all. Her voice was still the same as before, without any change. Li Yundong couldn't help but say with admiration, "You're really amazing. You haven't felt tired at all after singing for so long." Meiduo looked at Li Yundong with a smile. "If you like it, I'll sing for you." As she said this, she suddenly gathered her courage and grabbed Li Yundong's hand. "In the future, I'll only sing for you, okay?" After more than a month of hard work, Li Yundong's will was as firm as steel, but at this time, his heart was still pounding. He didn't know what to say. He knew that he wouldn't agree, but he was also afraid that if he said no, it would hurt this girl who was as pure as a snow lotus. Fortunately, at this time, Changbajila shouted, "Meiduo, it's time to eat." "You've been singing all morning. Aren't you hungry?" This sentence saved Li Yundong. He quickly said, "Let's go eat first." As he said this, he ignored Meiduo and fled in a panic. Meiduo stomped her feet angrily. That annoying Changbajila. Why didn't he say it earlier or later? Why did he say it now? I'm so angry. After lunch, Li Yundong spent the afternoon with the Tibetans. He no longer dared to be alone. Meiduo wanted to find an opportunity to get close to Li Yundong, but he found an opportunity to avoid her. Meiduo was so angry that she kept stomping her feet. It wasn't until evening when the Tibetans walked to a long winding river that Changbajila waved his horsewhip and shouted, "Let's rest here today." At a glance, Li Yundong saw that at this time, the sun was setting, and the sky was covered with fiery red clouds. In the distance, there was a holy snow-capped mountain, winding and continuous. Nearby, there was a silver satin-like river, passing through the green earth. At this time, as long as you took a photo frame and placed it anywhere, it would look like an oil painting with thick ink and heavy color. What a beautiful place! Li Yundong praised in his heart. He more and more understood why Ziyuan had asked him to come here to cultivate. Not only was it at a high altitude, but it was also closer to Yunjiutian. The air here was fresh, unlike the city, which was full of car exhaust and people breathed polluted air every day. Li Yundong looked around and felt that the world was wide. He suddenly felt enlightened, and the qi in his body was much more vigorous. This kind of situation was naturally more suitable for cultivating the Zhuji phase. Li Yundong looked at the clean river and suddenly had an idea. He wanted to take a bath in the river, but he knew that the Tibetans had their rules. Some rivers were not for bathing, so he found Changbajila and said, "Changbajila, I want to take a bath in the river. I wonder if that's okay." Changbajila thought for a while and said, "This river used to not allow people to take a bath casually, but you are the reincarnation of Mahagala, so of course you can take a bath in this river." Li Yundong smiled and said, "Then wouldn't I be making a special offer?" No, that's not good. I'd better not take a bath." Changbajila laughed and said, "We lack water resources in Tibet, so people rarely take a bath. You Han people are different from us. We can tolerate not taking a bath for a year, but you absolutely can't. Go ahead, it's okay. In fact, girls who like to be clean will also go to the river to take a bath. You're not the only one. Li Yundong was relieved and said goodbye to Changbajila. When he came out of the tent, he saw some Tibetan women going to the river to wash and take a bath in groups. When these women saw him, they smiled at him boldly and greeted him in Tibetan. Li Yundong smiled and watched them go away. Then he turned around and went to his tent, ready to take a bath in the evening. Changbajila watched Li Yundong go back to his tent. He stroked his beard, thought for a while, and then walked toward Maidwa's tent. Late at night, the sky was dotted with stars and the bright moon was hanging high in the sky. Li Yundong came out of the tent gently. He went to the river, took off his clothes, found a stone to press them down, and then jumped into the river. In the past, when Li Yundong had been an otaku in the city, he had never experienced the feeling of rushing for a month without taking a bath. As he rubbed his body, a layer of old mud immediately appeared on his body. He couldn't help but laugh and say, "Hey, I washed it once before. I didn't expect it to be so dirty after a few days. If that girl knew, she would dislike me." He was taking a bath alone, talking to himself. Suddenly, he heard a sound of water coming from the river. Li Yundong immediately became vigilant. He turned his head and shouted in a low voice, "Who is it?" When Li Yundong turned his head, he was immediately stunned. He saw Meidua walking into the river step by step. She was covering her chest with her hands, completely naked. The bright moonlight shone on Meidua's body, making her skin look as attractive as cheese. The girl stared at Li Yundong shyly and boldly. She said, "Han brother, it's me. Let me help you take a bath, okay?" Li Yundong felt as if his mind was about to explode. He watched helplessly as the naked girl approached him step by step. For a moment, he was at a loss and didn't know what to do. /om/ Chapter 181. Go to watch net. Meidua's enthusiasm was within Li Yundong's expectations, but Meidua's boldness was something he had never expected. For a moment, he watched the girl get closer and closer, and he couldn't help but step back. Go to watch net. 7ko/ Li Yundong stammered, "Why did you come to take a bath too?" This. Meidua looked at Li Yundong shyly and boldly. Her voice trembled slightly as she said, "Han brother, am I not beautiful?" Li Yundong saw that Meidua was covered in moonlight, as if she were wearing a layer of silver gauze. Although she was naked, it doubled her holy beauty. Even a blind man would open his eyes at this time to see the purest beauty in the world. Li Yundong only took a glance at her, and he felt his whole body heat up. He didn't dare to look at her again, so he turned around and wanted to escape. But Meidua grabbed his hand. The strength of her fingers and the firmness of her voice far exceeded Li Yundong's expectations. "Han brother, you also like me, don't you?" Li Yundong was forced into a corner by Meidua, but he calmed down. He took a deep breath and said in a deep voice, "Meidua, any man will like a girl like you." Hearing this, Meidua smiled and her ears turned red. "Then why did you run away when you saw me?" Li Yundong sighed. He turned around and looked straight into Meidua's eyes, not glancing at her snow-white chest at all. He said, "Because in my heart, there is already a girl I love deeply." Meidua's whole body shook violently. She looked at Li Yundong in horror. "Are you married?" Li Yundong shook his head. "No, I'm not married, but I already have a girlfriend." Meidua looked at Li Yundong and shook her head vigorously. "No, since you already have a girlfriend, why did you look at me like that?" Li Yundong sighed and said, "When I first saw you, I only felt that your eyes were pure, just like the girl I love deeply, so I subconsciously regarded you as her." With tears in her eyes, Meiduo said stubbornly, "You lied to me. You deliberately made up such a person, didn't you?" Li Yundong sighed slightly. He pulled Meiduo to the shore and draped the clothes she had taken off on the shore over her. He also put on his clothes with his back facing Meiduo. Then, he pulled Meiduo to sit on the shore and began to tell her the story of him and Su Chan watched net. Hongom Li Yundong was very eloquent. He told her all these things clearly, from their meeting, acquaintance, friendship, and love. When it came to the happy and funny parts, Meiduo laughed with tears in her eyes, completely forgetting the misery of being rejected by Li Yundong. When it came to the part where the two of them had almost separated because of the misunderstanding, Meiduo couldn't help crying again. In the end, Li Yundong said that in order to enforce justice on behalf of heaven, he had sent heavenly thunder to kill young Master He, and Su Chan had been taken away by her master because of him. Meiduo had cried because of the separation between the two of them. She asked with tears in her eyes, "What happened after that?" "After that?" Li Yundong let out a long sigh and said slowly, "After that, I understood a truth." Meiduo wiped away her tears and asked, "What is it?" Li Yundong sighed and said, "A man must be strong. If a man is not strong, he can't even protect himself, let alone the woman he loves." "So, you came here to cultivate?" Meiduo asked. Li Yundong nodded. "Yes, that's right." Meiduo was moved and said, "No wonder you walked all the way here. It turns out that you did it for the girl you love." Li Yundong smiled at Meiduo. "The song you sang before was really good. I asked Buddha, why does it always snow on a night that I don't care about? Buddha said, when people don't pay attention, they always miss a lot of real beauty. What a good song, but some real beauty is destined not to belong to me. If people are too greedy, they may even lose what they already have. Don't you think so?" Meiduo's eyes were fixed on Li Yundong. Although she had been rejected by Li Yundong, her love and admiration for this boy in her heart had deepened. She admired Li Yundong's courage and boldness in order to eradicate evil people, regardless of his own safety. She admired Li Yundong's persistence and perseverance in embarking on an extremely difficult cultivation for the girl he loved. Go to the internet. Meiduo's eyes were full of infatuation. She looked at Li Yundong's thick eyebrows and straight nose. She had always thought that this Han brother was not very handsome with a beard, but at this time, he looked mature, steady, and resolute. In the face of Li Yundong's question, Meiduo said in a daze, "Han brother, I understand. I won't stop you from cultivating. Can I sing another song for you?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "Okay, your singing is really like the sound of nature. It's so beautiful." Meiduo thought to herself, no matter how beautiful it is, it can't capture your heart. She calmed down, opened her red lips slightly, and sang. "You see me, or you don't see me. I'm there, neither sad nor happy. You read me, or you don't miss me. Love is there, neither coming nor going. You love me, or you don't love me. Love is there, neither increasing nor decreasing. You follow me, or you don't want to follow me. My hand is in your hand, and I won't give it up. Come to my arms, or let me live in your heart. Silence, love, silence, joy." Meiduo's singing was sad and touching. For a moment, Li Yundong was stunned. After Meiduo finished singing, she looked at Li Yundong in a daze. She saw that Li Yundong's eyes were fixed on the distance, and his expression was full of memories. Her heart was sour and bitter, and for a moment, she couldn't help but burst into tears. Meiduo wiped her tears, sobbed, turned her head, and ran back to her tent. She didn't even want the clothes on the ground. Li Yundong sat alone by the river in a daze. After a long time, he came to his senses and let out a long sigh. Early the next morning, Li Yundong took all his luggage to Changbajila and said goodbye to him. What? You're leaving? Changbajila was shocked and asked loudly. Li Yundong nodded and said with a firm expression, yes, I've disturbed you for several days. I'm a cultivator, and it's better for me to be alone. Changbajila opened his mouth. He wanted to ask him to stay, but he didn't know what to say. After a long time, he sighed and said, Han boy, you didn't give me a chance. Let me treat you to a feast when I get back and repay you for saving my life. Li Yundong smiled and said, Changbajila, I'm already very grateful for the Mahamudra secret method sutra you gave me. It's very useful to me. You don't have to be so polite anymore. I have to leave today. Seeing that Li Yundong had made up his mind, Changbajila didn't force him to stay. He just asked, does Meiduo know? Li Yundong nodded. Changbajila sighed and said, this child, alas, shall I ask her to see you off? Li Yundong shook his head and said, forget it. As he said this, he carried the fan of 7 treasures and his luggage and left Changbajila's tent. Changbajila chased after him and led a horse next to him. He stuffed the reins into Li Yundong's hand and said, take this with you. When you're tired on the way, it can also lighten your burden. Li Yundong smiled and said, Changbajila, I'm a cultivator. How can I do such a lazy thing? It's like taking a break on a pilgrimage. Would you be willing? Changbajila was silent. After a while, he said, then you should bring more food and water. That should be fine, right? Li Yundong thought for a moment and accepted Changbajila's kindness with a smile. He took a bag of highland barley cakes and a pot full of milk wine and set off again. At this time, the Tibetans in the camp had heard that Li Yundong was leaving, so they came over to say goodbye to him. Li Yundong smiled and said hello to them. He glanced around the crowd but didn't see Meiduo. He sighed in his heart and turned to leave. When Li Yundong had become a small black dot on the horizon, Meiduo ran over, panting. As she ran, she shouted, Changbajila, Han brother is leaving. When she ran to Changbajila, she stopped and looked at Li Yundong's back with a sad face. She held a pair of cloth shoes that had just been sewn in her hand and bit her lip tightly. She was silent, tears falling down her cheeks. Changbajila sighed and said, hurry up and catch up with him on my horse. It's not too late. Meiduo shook her head and choked with sobs. If he has me in his heart, he will look back. When he does, I will catch up with him and give him this pair of shoes. He has such a long way to go. How can he go without shoes? She looked at Li Yundong's back all the way, but he never looked back until his figure finally disappeared into the horizon. Meiduo couldn't help it anymore. She lay on Changbajila's shoulder and cried loudly. As she cried, she said, why won't he look back at me? Is there no place for me in his heart at all? Changbajila stroked Meiduo's hair lovingly. Silly girl, he's afraid that if he looks back at you, you will really live in his heart. When Meiduo heard this, she felt a little better. She wiped her tears and looked at Changbajila eagerly. Is what you said true? Changbajila smiled and sighed slightly. Well, don't cry. If fate wills it, we will meet again in the future. Meiduo looked in the direction where Li Yundong had gone and couldn't help singing again. That day, I closed my eyes in the fragrant mist of the scripture hall. Suddenly, I heard the mantra in your chanting. That month, I shook all the scripture buckets, not to release souls, but to touch your fingertips. That year, I kowtowed and crawled on the mountain road, not to see you, but to feel your warmth. That life, I turned the mountains, the rivers, and the pagodas, not to cultivate the next life, but to meet you on the way. Meiduo's singing was pleasant to the ear, and these Tibetan compatriots all knew it. But at this time, Meidua was singing from the bottom of her heart, and every sentence was from the bottom of her heart. Her true feelings were revealed, and her singing was particularly beautiful and touching. For a moment, everyone was stunned. The world was extremely quiet, and only the Tibetan girl's singing echoed gently, /om/. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.